My name is Deputy Marcus Hale, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the winter of 2013 in Silverton, Colorado. The mountain town sits at 9,300 feet, where the air cuts sharp and the old mining tunnels run deeper than most people care to think about. I've been telling myself for 11 years that I should write this down, get it out of my head somehow. Maybe then the dreams will stop. The Silverton police station squats like a brick toad on Green Street, one story of government-issue architecture that hasn't changed since the 1970s. 2 holding cells, 1 dispatch desk, and a break room that smells permanently of burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant. Officer Rodriguez and I had pulled the morning shift that day, coming on at 6 when the mountain shadows still stretched long across the valley floor. Rodriguez was good people. 28 years old, married to a teacher named Carmen, had a baby girl who gurgled when you made faces at her. He'd been talking about maybe applying to the state police, getting out of Silverton before the mine closures killed what was left of the town's economy. I told him he was smart to think ahead. Most of us mountain cops, we get comfortable with the quiet. We forget that quiet can turn deadly faster than a rock slide. The morning started routine enough. Keen enough. A fender bender on Highway 550, some teenagers caught smoking behind the high school, an elderly woman who called because she was sure someone was stealing her newspapers. The kind of calls that make you think police work in a small town is mostly about being a social worker with a badge and a radio. Social worker with a badge and a radio. No ID takes at 7:10 a.m. Dispatch crackled to life. Unit 12, we've got a disabled vehicle blocking County Road 110 about 2 miles north of the Mayflower Mill ruins. I clicked the radio, Unit 12 responding. County Road 110 winds through some of the most isolated country in the San Juan Mountains. Abandoned mine shafts dot the landscape like open wounds, most of them unmarked, some of them flooding slowly with groundwater that runs orange with iron oxide. It's the kind of place where you can disappear and not be found until the spring thaw, if then. The vehicle was a Chevy van, probably 20 years old, primer gray with Colorado plates so rusted I could barely make out the numbers. It sat crooked across the narrow dirt road, engine ticking as it cooled. Steam leaked from under the hood in thin white ribbons that dissipated quickly in the mountain air. I pulled up behind it, left my cruiser running, and approached on foot. Standard protocol for a disabled vehicle, though something about the scene felt off. The van's windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see inside, and there were no tracks in the dirt shoulder suggesting the driver had gotten out to check under the hood. I tapped on the driver's window with my knuckle. "Sir, police, are you all right in there?" "No, fine in there." The window rolled down with a mechanical whine, and I got my first look at the man who would haunt my nights for the next decade. He was maybe 45, pale skin that looked like it hadn't seen much sun, thin brown hair combed straight back. Nothing particularly memorable about his features except for his eyes, which had a flat, reflective quality that reminded me of creek water over stones. When he smiled, his teeth were the color of old newspaper. "Having some trouble with the engine," he said. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Overheated, I think. Don't know much about cars." The smell hit me then. Bleach, sharp and chemical, mixed with something else I couldn't immediately identify. Something organic and wrong. "What's your name, sir?" "Harlan Pike." He fumbled in his jacket pocket and came up empty. Don't have my license on me. Left it at home." I noticed a small tattoo under his left ear as he turned to look for his wallet. A pig's head, crude black ink, like prison, work. His right arm bulged strangely, as if he was wearing 2 shirts, and when he moved I heard something crinkle like plastic. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Pike?" "Delivery?" he said, gesturing toward the back of the van. Had a cooler of meat for a customer up the mountain, but it's starting to spoil in this heat, probably ruined by now. It was 28 degrees outside. There was no heat to speak of. "Mind if I take a look at what you're hauling?" You're hauling? Something shifted behind his eyes, just for a second, but he nodded agreeably enough. Sure thing, deputy, though like I said, it's probably spoiled by now. The back doors of the van opened with a squeal of hinges that needed oil. Needed oil. Inside, secured with bungee cords, was a large white cooler, the kind you'd use for a fishing trip or a tailgate party. Except this one was pristine, hospital clean, and there was a biohazard symbol stenciled on the lid in red letters. What kind of meat did you say this was? Pike had moved closer, close enough that I could smell the bleach on his clothes more strongly. Specialty cuts for a restaurant. I popped the cooler's latches and lifted the lid. The inside was packed with ice and surgical drapes, the kind of sterile blue material you see in operating rooms. Nested among the ice were several clear plastic containers, each about the size of a paperback book, filled with what looked like dark red tissue suspended in clear fluid. Jesus, I whispered. Kidneys? Pike said helpfully. Human kidneys, Pike said helpfully. Though between you and me, deputy, I don't think that restaurant is going to be serving them to the general public. I reached for my radio, but Pike was already moving. His right hand came up from inside his jacket, and I saw the blade flash in the morning sun. An insurrectus in the morning sun. Not a knife exactly, but surgical shears, the kind used to cut through bone. I twisted away from the thrust, but the blade caught the edge of my vest and sliced through the Kevlar like it was tissue paper. Pike was faster than his soft appearance suggested, and stronger. He grabbed my radio hand, twisted until I dropped it, then brought his knee up toward my groin. Training kicked in. I grabbed his wrist, pivoted, and threw him over my hip onto the van's rear bumper. The shears skittered across the gravel, and I went for my sidearm. Pike rolled, came up with a handful of road dirt, and threw it at my face. While I was blinking grit out of my eyes, he bolted for the tree line. I should have pursued him immediately, but something about the cooler and its contents made me hesitate. Those weren't animal organs. The containers were labeled with medical terminology I didn't recognize, but the implications were clear enough. Someone was harvesting human organs, and Pike was the delivery man. I keyed my shoulder radio. Dispatch Unit 12. I need backup and an ambulance at County Road 110, mile marker 15. Suspect fled on foot into the woods. Possible homicide investigation. Copy, Unit 12. Backup is 20 minutes out. 20 minutes in mountain country might as well be 20 hours. Pike could be miles away by then, lost in the maze of abandoned mine shafts and hunting trails that crisscross the high country. But as I stood there looking at that cooler full of horrors, I realized that catching Pike might be the least of my problems. Someone was buying what he was selling. Someone with money and connections and the kind of reach that could keep an operation like this running. Someone who wouldn't be happy that their delivery driver had just been compromised. I secured the van as a crime scene and waited for backup, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already being watched from the tree line. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch that rustled in the wind sounded like footsteps. The mountain had gone very quiet, the way it does before a storm. Rodriguez arrived first, his cruiser kicking up a rooster tail of dust as he pulled up behind mine. He took one look at the cooler's contents and went pale under his tan. Holy shit, Marcus. What the hell did you stumble into? Nothing good, I said, snapping photos of the van's interior with my digital camera. Guy called himself Harlan Pike, got away into the woods when I tried to detain him. No ID, no registration, and this van doesn't show up in any database I can access from here. The state police arrived 40 minutes later, followed by a crime scene team from Durango. They cordoned off the area, photographed everything, and loaded the cooler into an evidence van like it contained nuclear material. The lead investigator, a severe woman named Detective Santos, questioned me for 2 hours about every detail of my encounter with Pike. "You're sure about the tattoo? We're sure about the tattoo," she asked for the third time. Pig's head under his left ear looked like prison ink. She made a note. We'll run it through the gang database, see if it matches any known symbols. What about the smell you mentioned? Bleach, mostly, but something else underneath. Something. I searched for the right word. Rotten. Santos closed her notebook. We'll have the lab analyze everything, but my guess is you interrupted a very sophisticated organ trafficking operation, the kind that usually has multiple layers of protection. Meaning. Meaning Pike is probably the low man on a very tall totem pole, and the people above him aren't going to be happy that he got burned. She was right, of course, but at the time, I thought the danger had passed. Pike was gone, the evidence was secure, and the state police would handle the investigation from here. I figured I'd write my report, testify at trial if it came to that, and eventually the whole thing would fade into the background noise of police work. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. Dead wrong. The first sign that something was seriously amiss came 3 days later. I was working the night shift, alone in the station, while Rodriguez covered a domestic disturbance call across town. It was past midnight, quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional pop from the aging heating system. I was catching up on paperwork when I heard it, a soft scraping sound from somewhere below the building, like metal against stone, rhythmic and deliberate. I listened for a few minutes, thinking it might be settling pipes or maybe a rodent in the walls, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful. The Silverton station was built in 1974 on what used to be the site of a boarding house for miners. Before that, the lot had been empty land at the edge of one of the larger mine claims. I'd never given much thought to what might be underneath the building, but as I sat there listening to that scraping sound, I started to wonder. Hey, I grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet and went outside to check the foundation. The building sat on a concrete slab, standard construction for the era, but as I walked around the perimeter, I noticed something odd. On the north side, where the evidence room backed up against the alley, there was a section of foundation that looked newer than the rest. The concrete was a slightly different color, and the surface was smoother, like it had been poured more recently. The scraping stopped as soon as I stepped outside. I circled the building twice more, but everything was quiet. No tracks in the snow, no signs of disturbance, just that patch of newer concrete and a growing certainty that something was very wrong. The next morning, I called the town manager's office and asked about building permits and construction records for the station. It took them 3 hours to dig up the files, but what they found was interesting. In 1987, 13 years after the original construction, the town had paid for foundation repairs and utility upgrades to the building. The work had been done by a contractor from Grand Junction who was no longer in business. I requested the original blueprints for the building and compared them to what had actually been built. The evidence room was supposed to be 8 feet by 12 feet. The actual room was only 8 feet by 10 feet. Somewhere in the renovation, 2 feet of space had disappeared. That night, I came in early and went straight to the evidence room. It was cramped and windowless, lined with metal shelving that held boxes of case files dating back to the 1980s. The rear wall was standard drywall over framing, painted institutional beige. But when I tapped on it with my knuckle, it sounded hollow. I found a utility knife in the supply closet and carefully cut through the paint along what looked like a seam in the wall. The drywall came away in a neat rectangle, revealing a sheet of plywood underneath. The plywood wasn't attached to the framing. It was held in place by friction and gravity. Behind the plywood was darkness. I shone my flashlight into the gap and saw rough stone walls, old timber supports, and the glint of metal rails disappearing into the black. It was a mine tunnel, just like thousands of others that honeycombed the mountains around Silverton. Except this one had been deliberately concealed behind a false wall. The air that drifted out smelled of earth and moisture and something else. Something chemical and wrong, like the smell that had clung to Pike's clothes. I should have called for backup, should have contacted the state police and let them handle it. But something about that tunnel called to me, whispered that the answers I needed were waiting in the dark below. Konda. Oh. I climbed through the opening and dropped down onto the tunnel floor, my boots ringing against old steel rails. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle grade, following what had probably been a vein of silver ore a century ago. Electric cables had been strung along the walls at some point, though most of the light fixtures were dark. I followed the tunnel for maybe 50 yards before it opened into a wider chamber. Here, someone had installed more recent improvements: battery-powered LED strips along the walls, plastic sheeting to keep out moisture, and heavy steel doors set into the far wall. The door was ajar and light leaked out around the edges. I drew my sidearm and approached carefully. Through the gap, I could see what looked like a medical facility. Stainless steel tables, glass-fronted cabinets full of surgical instruments, and a row of chest freezers humming quietly against one wall. The smell was stronger here, bleach and antiseptic, but underneath it the unmistakable odor of death. I pushed the door open with my foot and stepped inside, gun raised. The room was empty of people, but full of horrors. The freezers contained dozens of organs floating in preservation fluid, each one labeled with medical terminology and what looked like serial numbers. The surgical tables were stained with old blood, and the instruments in the cabinets were arranged with a kind of precision that spoke of frequent use. On a desk in the corner, I found a ledger book filled with entries in multiple handwritings. Dates, times, descriptions of inventory, and dollar amounts that made my stomach turn. The most recent entry was dated 2 days ago. 2 kidneys, 1 liver, grade A condition. Payment pending delivery. That's when I heard the footsteps in the tunnel behind me. I killed the lights and pressed myself against the wall beside the door, listening. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving carefully but not quietly enough. At least 3 people, maybe more. They were trying to be stealthy, but the tunnel acoustics carried every scrape of boot leather against stone. The voices were low, conversational, professional. Should have been more careful with the deputy. Pike was always sloppy. That's why we keep him on delivery. Containment is the priority now. Clean up the mess. I eased my radio off my belt and keyed it to transmit, but got only static. The mountain and all that rock between me and the surface were blocking the signal. I was on my own, trapped in an underground surgical suite with a team of people who spoke about murder the way most folks discuss the weather. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Right. LED flashlight beams swept across the room, and I heard someone curse softly. Lights are off. That's not right. Maybe the generator kicked off again. Check the power panel. I had maybe 30 seconds before they discovered I was there. The room had only one exit, and they were standing in it. But the freezers were large enough to hide behind, and the shadows in the corners were deep enough to conceal a man if he stayed very still. I moved carefully along the wall toward the back of the room, where the largest freezer hummed against the stone. As I passed one of the surgical tables, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Leather restraints attached to the corners, stained dark with old blood. This wasn't just an organ harvesting operation. They were taking people alive. The first man through the door was tall and thin, dressed in hospital scrubs under a heavy coat. He carried a medical bag in one hand and a pistol in the other. Behind him came Pike, looking more alert and dangerous than he had during our encounter on the mountain road. The third man was young, maybe 25, with the kind of military bearing that suggested special forces training. "Power's fine," Pike said, flipping a switch. The lead strips buzzed back to life. "Someone's been here. Teen here." The tall man in scrubs a doctor, I realized, seeing the way he moved around the medical equipment, checked the ledger book on the desk. Nothing's been taken, but someone definitely disturbed things. "The deputy," Pike said. "Has to be. I told you we should have dealt with him immediately." "And I told you that killing a cop brings heat we don't need," the doctor replied. "Better to relocate and start fresh somewhere else." The young man with military bearing spoke for the first time. Too late for that now. He's seen too much. We have to assume he's already reported it. Kika. They moved around the room with practiced efficiency, checking the freezers and gathering instruments into metal cases. These weren't amateurs or opportunists. This was an organized operation with protocols and procedures, the kind of thing that required serious money and serious connections. Fang. I stayed hidden behind the freezer, trying to think of a way out. My radio was useless down here, and even if I could get a signal, backup was 20 minutes away, under the best circumstances. By the time help arrived, these three would be long gone, and I'd probably be strapped to one of those tables. The doctor was muttering as he worked. 3 years building this up, perfect location. Now we have to start over because Pike couldn't handle a simple traffic stop. We've got fallback sites, the young man said. Colorado Springs, Albuquerque. We can be operational again in a week. What about the client list? Pike asked. Encrypted and backed up. We don't lose anything except time. What time? They were almost finished packing when the doctor stopped and sniffed the air. Do you smell that? Pike paused. Smell what? Aftershave. Someone's been here recently. The young man drew his weapon, a compact pistol that looked military issue. Spread out. Check every corner. I had maybe 10 seconds before they found me. The freezer I was hiding behind was on wheels, and there was just enough space between it and the wall for a man to squeeze through. I took a deep breath and pushed. The freezer rolled forward 6 inches, just enough to block the narrow aisle between the surgical tables. The young man with the gun came around the left side while Pike approached from the right. The doctor stayed by the door, blocking my exit. Police, I shouted, rising from behind the freezer with my weapon drawn. Drop your weapons and get on the ground. The young man dove behind a table and started shooting. His first round sparked off the freezer's metal surface inches from my head. I returned fire, punching 2 holes through the tabletop where he was hiding. Pike had a knife again, those same surgical shears he'd tried to gut me with on the mountain road. He came at me in a low crouch, using the medical equipment for cover. I put a round into his shoulder that spun him around, but he kept coming. The doctor was shouting into a radio. Emergency extraction, underground facility compromised. 3 minutes. Pike reached me just as I was swinging my gun toward the young man behind the table. The shears caught the underside of my gun hand, opening a gash from wrist to knuckle. I dropped my weapon and grabbed Pike's wrist with my good hand. We wrestled between the surgical tables, knocking over instrument trays and IZ stands. Pike was wiry and desperate, fighting like a man who knew this was his last chance. But he was also bleeding from the shoulder wound, and I was younger and stronger. I got my forearm across his throat and applied pressure. He thrashed for maybe 30 seconds before going limp. The young man had stopped shooting and was moving toward the door. I scrambled for my dropped weapon, but he was already past the doctor and disappearing into the tunnel. The doctor looked at me for a moment, his face calculating, then followed the gunman into the darkness. I heard them running down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. An engine started somewhere in the distance, muffled by rock and earth. By the time I reached the tunnel entrance, they were gone. Pike was unconscious but alive, bleeding slowly from the shoulder wound. I cuffed him with my spare zip ties and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. Then I climbed back up through the evidence room and called for backup, an ambulance, and every available unit in 3 counties. It took the crime scene team 6 hours to process the underground facility. They found enough evidence to support charges against a dozen people, including detailed records of organ sales dating back 3 years. The operation had been supplying black market organs to wealthy clients across the Southwest, using homeless people and undocumented immigrants as unwilling donors. Pike survived surgery and was arraigned on federal charges. He refused to cooperate with investigators, but the records they found in the underground facility told the story. The network included surgeons, organ brokers, and what the FBI described as procurement specialists, people who kidnapped victims and transported them to surgery sites. The doctor and the young gunman were never found. The FBI believed they were part of a larger organization with operations in multiple states, possibly multiple countries. The investigation was ongoing, they said, but I got the impression that the important players had escaped. 3 weeks after the raid on the underground facility, I got a call at home. It was just after midnight, and the voice on the other end was cultured, educated, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. Deputy Hale, I believe you have something that belongs to me. I sat up in bed, instantly awake. Who is this? Someone who invests considerable time and money in maintaining profitable enterprises. You've caused significant disruption to one of those enterprises. If you're talking about the organ trafficking ring, that operation is shut down. Yeah. Pike is in federal custody and the FBI has your records. The man on the phone chuckled softly. Pike is expendable. The records are replaceable. But you, Deputy Hale, you're a problem that requires a more permanent solution. The line went dead. I called the FBI immediately and reported the threat. They put a watch on my house and assigned an agent to coordinate with local law enforcement. But I knew it was mostly theater. If this organization was as sophisticated as it appeared, they could wait months or years for the right opportunity. I started carrying my weapon off duty and checking my car for bombs before starting the engine. I varied my routes to and from work, never parked in the same place twice, and installed motion sensors around my house. The precautions became second nature after a while, but the paranoia never quite went away. 2 months later, Rodriguez came to me with disturbing news. We've got a problem, Rodriguez said, sliding a manila folder across my desk. His face was grim, and I could see he'd been losing sleep. Dark circles under his eyes, 3 days of stubble, the kind of look cops get when a case starts eating at them. Inside the folder were crime scene photos from Durango, 60 miles south of Silverton. A homeless camp under the highway overpass. 5 bodies discovered by a road crew that morning. Soza. All of them were missing organs. Medical examiner says the surgical work was professional, Rodriguez continued. Clean incisions, proper technique, organs removed while the victims were still alive, just like the facility we found under the station. I studied the photos, trying to push down the sick feeling in my stomach. These weren't random killings. Someone was rebuilding the network, establishing new procurement sites and surgery centers. The voice on the phone had been right. Pike was expendable, and shutting down one location had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. FBI know about this? They're en route. But Marcus, there's more. Rodriguez pulled out a second set of photos. 3 similar scenes in the past month. One in Cortez, one outside Pagosa Springs, and one just north of Alamosa. All homeless victims, all professionally harvested. I looked at the map he'd sketched on a yellow legal pad. The locations formed a rough circle around the Four Corners region, with Silverton near the center. Someone was establishing a network of killing sites, probably mobile units that could be moved quickly if discovered. They're hunting, I said, systematically working their way through the transient population. People who won't be missed, who don't have families filing missing person reports. That's what I think too. But here's what really bothers me. Rodriguez leaned forward, lowering his voice even though we were alone in the station. I've been making calls, talking to other departments in the region. At least 4 cops have reported strange encounters in the past month. Almost a month. Traffic stops that went sideways, suspicious vehicles that disappeared before backup could arrive. One deputy in Cortez swears he was being followed for 3 days. The paranoia I'd been fighting suddenly seemed a lot more reasonable. They're scouting law enforcement response times. Learning our patrol patterns, figuring out how long they have to work before we show up. And Marcus, that deputy in Cortez who thought he was being followed? His name is Mike Santos. He's the one who found the homeless camp outside Pagosa Springs. The implication hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just hunting transients anymore. They were hunting cops, specifically cops who had interfered with their operations. Santos had found one of their kill sites, just like I'd found their underground facility. Now he was a target, just like me. I reached for the phone to call the FBI, but Rodriguez stopped me. "There's one more thing," he said. "Carmen got a call at home yesterday." Man with an accent asking about her schedule at the school, what time she gets off work, what route she drives home. Carmen was Rodriguez's wife, a kindergarten teacher who wouldn't hurt a fly, who made cookies for the church bake sale and volunteered at the animal shelter. If they were threatening her, it meant the rules had changed completely. "You need to get her out of town," I said. "Today, right now." "Already done. She's staying with her sister in Denver until this is over." "But Marcus, what if it's never over? What if these people just keep coming?" It was a question I'd been asking myself every night for 2 months. The organization behind the organ trafficking network had resources and reach that extended far beyond anything we could handle at the local level. Even the FBI seemed to be struggling with the scope of the investigation. Arresting Pike and shutting down one facility had been like stepping on an anthill. It had scattered the insects, but it hadn't destroyed the colony. My phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number with a Colorado area code. Deputy Hale speaking. "Yeah, hello again, Deputy." "Hihalaya." The same cultured voice from my midnight call 2 months earlier. "I hope you've had time to consider our previous conversation." I gestured for Rodriguez to pick up the extension and start recording. "What do you want?" "Your cooperation." "Your cooperation." "You've proven to be remarkably resourceful, and we have need of someone with your skills. I'm not interested in working for organ thieves and murderers." The man chuckled. "Such moral certainty. But tell me, Deputy, how much do you know about your friend Officer Rodriguez's financial situation?" I felt the world tilt sideways. Rodriguez was staring at me from across the room, his face pale, his wife's medical bills from last year's cancer treatment, the voice continued. The second mortgage on their house. The credit card debt that's spiraling out of control despite their best efforts. "We know everything, Deputy Hale, and we know that Carmen's remission is still very fragile." Rodriguez closed his eyes and sank into his chair. Carmen's cancer had been diagnosed 8 months ago, and the treatment had been brutal and expensive. Even with insurance, the medical bills had nearly bankrupted them. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "Officer Rodriguez has been very helpful to our organization, whether he realizes it or not. Information about patrol schedules, response times, nothing that directly compromised any investigations. You understand. Just background information that helped us avoid unnecessary confrontations." I looked at Rodriguez, saw the shame and terror in his eyes. He'd been feeding information to the organ traffickers, probably without fully understanding what he was doing or who he was helping. "In exchange," the voice continued, "we've been helping with Carmen's medical expenses. Anonymous payments to the hospital, mysterious insurance adjustments that reduce their out-of-pocket costs. Nothing traceable, of course." "You son of a bitch," I whispered. "Now, Deputy, that kind of language isn't productive. Officer Rodriguez has been a valuable asset, but we need someone with your investigative skills and your access to federal information. The FBI task force is becoming inconvenient for our operations. I'll never help you." "Oh, but you will. But you will. Because if you don't, Carmen Rodriguez's cancer will return. Perhaps not naturally, these things can be arranged. And there will be tragic accidents. Officer Rodriguez might not survive his next traffic stop. You yourself might discover that your car's brakes have mysteriously failed on a mountain road." The line went dead. Rodriguez was crying now, great shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. "I'm sorry, Marcus. God, I'm so sorry." They started calling 6 months ago. just asking questions about department procedures, nothing that seemed important. Then Carmen got sick, and the bills started piling up, and they said they could help if I just kept answering questions. I wanted to be angry with him, but I couldn't. These people were professionals at manipulation and coercion. They'd identified his weakness and exploited it with surgical precision, just like they harvested organs from their victims. Nor victims. How much have you told them? Everything, he whispered. Patrol schedules, evidence, procedures. When the state police were planning raids, I thought if I could keep Carmen alive, I could find a way to stop helping them later. But there is no later. Is there? They own me now. The federal agents arrived an hour later, led by Detective Santos, the same severe woman who had questioned me after Pike's arrest. She listened to Rodriguez's confession without comment, then had him sign a detailed statement admitting to providing information to a criminal organization. We can offer protection, she said, but it will mean entering the witness protection program. New identities, new lives, probably in different states. You'll never be able to contact your families or return to Colorado. What about going after the people who did this? I asked. Santos shook her head. We've been tracking this organization for 3 years. They're international, with cells operating in at least 6 countries. Every time we shut down one operation, 2 more pop up. The best we can do is damage control and protecting the people they've targeted. So they win. They always win. Deputy Hale. People like this, they have resources and patience that law enforcement can't match. The only choice is whether you want to be a victim or a survivor. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of whiskey and my service weapon on the table in front of me. The smart play was obvious. Take the FBI protection offer, disappear into a new identity, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Let someone else fight the ghosts. But I kept thinking about those photos from the homeless camps, about Carmen Rodriguez's medical bills being paid with blood money, about the voice on the phone that spoke of murder, like a business transaction. Sometimes the smart play isn't the right play. I picked up the phone and dialed the number that had called me twice. I want to make a deal, I said when the cultured voice answered. The meeting was set for midnight at the abandoned Mayflower Mill, the same area where I'd first encountered Pike 3 months earlier. I drove there alone, against explicit FBI orders, carrying only my service weapon and a wire that Detective Santos had insisted on taping to my chest. This is suicide, she told me during the briefing. These people have killed dozens of victims. What makes you think they'll honor any agreement with you? Because they need something from me, I'd replied. Information about the federal investigation, access to evidence, someone inside law enforcement who can warn them about raids. I'm more valuable to them alive than dead. It was a calculated risk based on my understanding of how the organization operated. They were business people first, killers second. Every murder had been committed to protect their operations or eliminate threats. If I could convince them that I was an asset rather than a liability, I might have a chance. The Mayflower Mill squatted against the mountainside like a technological ghost, its rusted machinery and collapsing buildings testament to Silverton's mining past. During the day, it was a tourist attraction where families took photos and kids climbed on the old equipment. At night, it was a landscape of shadows and decay that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I parked near the main building and waited. The wire in my chest felt like a metal snake coiled against my ribs, and I could hear my own heartbeat amplified in my ears. Every shadow might hide a sniper, every sound might be the approach of killers. At 12:15, a black SUV materialized from the darkness and parked 50 yards away. 3 figures got out, the doctor from the underground facility, the young gunman, and a woman I hadn't seen before. She was maybe 50, well-dressed in a way that suggested serious money, and she moved with the kind of confidence that comes from being accustomed to power. They approached slowly. hands visible, no obvious weapons. The woman walked slightly ahead of the other two, marking her as the person in charge. "Deputy Hale," she said when they were close enough to talk without shouting. Her voice was the cultured accent from the phone calls. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Let's skip the pleasantries," I said. "What do you want from me?" She smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Direct. I appreciate that in a man." "Very well. We want information about the federal task force investigating our operation. Specifically, we want to know about planned raids, evidence that's been collected, and the identities of any confidential informants. In exchange for what? Your life. Officer Rodriguez's life. His wife's continued good health. The lives of several other law enforcement officers who have become inconvenient for our organization." She gestured, and the young gunman produced a tablet computer. The screen showed surveillance photos of at least a dozen cops from departments across Colorado and New Mexico. All of them had apparently interfered with the organization's operations in some way. "We prefer cooperation to elimination," the woman continued, "but we're prepared for either option." I pretended to consider the offer while counting the seconds that had passed since the conversation began. The FBI surveillance team was positioned in the tree line around the mill, but they needed enough recorded evidence to make arrests that would stick in court. "How do I know you won't just kill me once you get what you want? Because we're business people." Deputy Hale. "We honor our agreements when it's profitable to do so. You provide us with information, we provide you with protection and compensation. Everyone benefits." The doctor stepped forward. "We've already demonstrated our commitment to cooperation with Officer Rodriguez. His wife's medical treatments have been quite expensive, but she's receiving the finest care available." "Speaking of Rodriguez," I said, "where is he? I want to see him before I agree to anything." The woman nodded to the young gunman, who spoke into a radio. A few minutes later, another vehicle approached from the opposite direction. Rodriguez got out of the passenger side, flanked by two men in dark clothing. Even at a distance, I could see that his hands were zip-tied behind his back. "He's unharmed," the woman said. "And he'll remain that way as long as you cooperate." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Rodriguez was close enough for the FBI snipers to have clear shots at his guards, and all the principal players in the organization were exposed in the open ground around the mill. I keyed the transmitter hidden in my jacket pocket. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Floodlights blazed to life from positions around the mill, turning night into harsh white day. Amplified voices shouted commands. "FBI, you're surrounded. Drop your weapons and get on the ground." The woman's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "You're making a mistake, deputy." "The only mistake I made was taking 3 months to do this." The young gunman was reaching for his weapon when the first sniper's bullet took him in the chest. He dropped without firing a shot. The doctor tried to run and made it maybe 10 yards before a second bullet dropped him face first into the gravel. Then stood perfectly still, hands raised as FBI agents converged from all directions. She looked at me with something that might have been respect. "This isn't over," she said as they cuffed her. "Yes, it is," I replied. But even as I said it, I knew she was probably right. The trials took 18 months. The woman, whose real name turned out to be Dr. Elena Vasquez, was convicted on 47 counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. She received 7 consecutive life sentences and was sent to a federal prison in Colorado, where she would die behind bars. The organization's network proved to be even larger than the FBI had suspected. Raids in 6 states and 3 countries netted over 200 arrests, shut down dozens of illegal surgical facilities, and rescued 19 victims who were being held for organ harvesting. Rodriguez served 6 months in federal prison for his cooperation with the traffickers, then entered the witness protection program with Carmen. I got a postcard from him last Christmas, no return address, just a photo of a beach somewhere, and a note saying they were doing well. And they were doing well. Pike died in prison before his trial began. Someone stabbed him 17 times in the shower room at the Federal Detention Center in Denver. The killing was never solved. But I suspected that Dr. Vasquez had long reach even from behind bars. I stayed in Silverton another 2 years before accepting a job with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The work is similar, investigating organized crime, human trafficking, cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries, but I travel more now, and I never stay in one place long enough to establish patterns that enemies could exploit. The underground facility beneath the Silverton police station was sealed with concrete after the investigation concluded. The evidence room was rebuilt on the opposite side of the building, and the tunnels were filled with cement to prevent future access. But sometimes late at night when I'm passing through town on other business, I can still hear the ghosts down there in the darkness. The nightmares have faded, mostly. I don't wake up in cold sweats anymore, and I've stopped checking my car for bombs every morning. But I still vary my routes, still carry my weapon off duty, still look twice at every shadow. Because I learned something important during those months in 2013. Evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare and dramatic gestures. It comes quietly, wearing ordinary faces, speaking in reasonable voices about practical solutions to difficult problems. It offers to help with your medical bills, your mortgage payments, your sick wife's cancer treatments. And once you accept that help, once you compromise just a little bit to protect the people you love, the ghosts have you. They own a piece of your soul, and they'll never let you go. The mountains around Silverton are full of abandoned mines, dark holes in the earth where men once dug for silver and gold. Most of them are empty now, flooded with groundwater or collapsed from decades of neglect. But some of them hide other things: secret facilities, unmarked graves, evidence of crimes that will never be solved. On clear nights, when the wind is just right, you can hear voices echoing from those deep places. The ghosts of victims, perhaps, or maybe just the sound of evil being born in the darkness below. I don't go looking for those voices anymore. I've learned to live with the knowledge that some horrors are too big to fight, too well-funded and organized to defeat. The best you can do is survive, protect the people you can protect, and hope that someone else will take up the fight when you're gone. But sometimes, driving through the mountains on a case, I'll see an abandoned mine shaft or a lonely stretch of highway where a van might stall at just the right moment. And I'll remember that there are still predators out there, still people who speak of murder like a business transaction, and still organizations that harvest human beings like cattle. The ghosts are still hungry, and they're still hunting. I never should have ignored the warnings about Salchua Point. The memory of that day in 2008 still haunts me, clinging to my thoughts like the thick morning fog that blanketed Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was 34 then, working forestry with a state contract to map endangered plant species across the region. My name's Clyde Red Bear, Apache on my father's side, Chippewa on my mother's. Mom always said I inherited Dad's stubborn streak, which probably explains why I disregarded every story, every warning I'd ever heard about those woods. Most days, my job was solitary and predictable. I'd hike for miles, documenting soil patterns and vegetation, rarely encountering anyone else. The isolation suited me. I developed a reputation as reliable but not particularly sociable, the kind of guy who got the job done without unnecessary conversation. That particular Tuesday in late September started differently. My supervisor called the night before, informing me I'd be paired with an intern named Marcus for the Sulchwa Point expedition. Kid's eager, studying conservation biology at Northern Michigan University. Show him the ropes, will you? He could use the field experience. I grunted in affirmative, not thrilled about having company, but not bothered enough to argue. When I pulled my weathered Ford Ranger into the forestry department parking lot the next morning, I spotted him immediately. Tall, lanky, early 20s with an expensive-looking backpack and boots that hadn't seen enough trail to develop proper creases. Marcus Walsh, he introduced himself, extending his hand with an enthusiastic grip. Really appreciate you taking me along, Mr. Red Bear. I've read your reports on the native medicinal plants in the region. Fascinating methodology. His enthusiasm was unexpected. Most interns barely knew my name, let alone my work. Just Clyde, I corrected, loading my gear into the truck. We're heading to Sulchwa Point. It's about an hour's drive. Then we'll be on foot most of the day. Marcus nodded eagerly, climbing into the passenger seat. As we pulled away, he launched into a detailed monologue about his thesis project on conservation economics. The kid was smart, no question, but my God, could he talk. For the entire drive, he barely paused for breath, shifting from academic theories to personal anecdotes to questions about my experience. I answered in brief sentences when required, focusing on the winding road ahead. The first hint of unease came when I turned onto the unmarked dirt road leading to our starting point. Marcus suddenly went quiet. I glanced over and found him staring at the dense pines lining the route, his expression unreadable. Something wrong? I asked. He shook his head slightly. Just... My grandmother used to tell stories about this area. She was Ojibwe. Kid, there were places in these woods where the boundary between worlds gets thin. I grunted non-committally. Every tribe had their legends about forbidden places. My mother had her share of stories too, warnings passed down through generations about territories where certain spirits dwelled. But I'd been working these forests for 15 years without incident. Respect the land, move with purpose, and nature generally left you alone. That was my philosophy. We parked at the trailhead, a barely visible opening in the thick forest marked only by a faded wooden post. The morning was unusually still. No breeze disturbed the treetops, no birds called from the branches, just the heavy silence of ancient woods. We'll follow this trail about 3 miles in, I explained, shouldering my pack. There's a section near the old creek bed where several endangered orchid species have been reported. Our job is to document their distribution and take soil samples. Marcus nodded, checking his GPS unit. Lead the way. The trail was overgrown, clearly unused for months or possibly years. The further we ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. Tall pines gave way to ancient oaks and maples, their branches forming a canopy so dense that by mid-morning it felt like dusk beneath them. Marcus had resumed his chatter, but even his voice seemed muffled by the heaviness of the air. He was cataloging plants we passed, reciting Latin names and ecological significance with impressive accuracy. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated his knowledge. By noon, we'd covered about 2 miles, stopping occasionally to document plant specimens. I was focused on a patch of ferns when Marcus called out from several yards ahead. Clyde, you need to see this. Something in his tone made me straighten immediately. Crane immediately. Gone was the enthusiastic student. His voice now held a note of confusion, maybe even alarm. I made my way to where he stood, kneeling beside what looked like disturbed earth. What do you make of this? He asked, gesturing to the ground before him. I crouched down, studying the marks carefully. Something had gouged deep furrows into the soil, 4 parallel lines about 8 inches apart, too methodical for random animal activity. They weren't bear tracks, too narrow for that. Not wolf, not moose, not anything I recognized from 15 years in these woods. Could be I started, then stopped myself. In truth, I had no explanation. Marcus snapped a few photos with his digital camera. It's weird, right? Almost like something was dragged through here, but the pattern is too regular. I nodded, unable to shake the growing sensation of being watched. The forest remained eerily silent around us, as if holding its breath. A cloud passed overhead, momentarily dimming the filtered light that reached the forest floor. Let's keep moving, I said, standing and adjusting my pack. We still have ground to cover before heading back. As we continued deeper into the woods, neither of us mentioned the strange markings again, but I noticed Marcus had stopped talking, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by watchful silence. He stayed closer to me now, no longer wandering ahead to examine plants that caught his interest. The air grew colder as we walked, unusually so for September. I checked my watch. Just past 1 p.m., yet it felt like late evening beneath the increasingly dense canopy. Shadows seemed to stretch in impossible directions, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. Do you feel that? Marcus whispered suddenly, stopping in his tracks. I paused, sensing what he meant before he elaborated. There was a subtle vibration in the ground, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Like something large moving in the distance, probably just logging equipment on the other side of the ridge, I said, not believing in myself. The nearest active logging site was miles away. Marcus looked unconvinced but nodded. Yeah, probably. We pressed on, the trail narrowing until it was barely discernible from the surrounding undergrowth. The trees grew more twisted here, their bark darker, with strange patterns that reminded me of the warnings my mother used to whisper about marked places, boundaries where the old spirits claimed dominion. For the first time in my career, I considered turning back. Something about these woods felt wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. But professional pride kept me moving forward. We had a job to do, data to collect. Besides, what would I tell my supervisor? That the forest gave me the creeps? So we continued deeper into Sulchwa Point, unaware that with each step, we were crossing into territory where no amount of scientific training or rational thinking would save us from what waited ahead. By early afternoon, the forest had transformed around us. What started as typical Upper Peninsula woodland had subtly shifted into something older, primeval. The trees stood further apart here, their trunks massive and gnarled, covered in lichen patterns I'd never seen in all my years of field work. The air felt dense, almost resistant to our movement, like walking through invisible cobwebs. Marcus had fallen completely silent, his earlier enthusiasm thoroughly dampened. I caught him glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack. You hearing something? I asked, pausing to listen. He shook his head, then hesitated. Not hearing, feeling, like something's off. I knew what he meant. The forest had gone beyond quiet. It felt abandoned, as if every living creature had fled hours ago, leaving just the two of us trespassing in an empty sanctuary. Well, even the insects had gone silent, no buzz of mosquitoes or flies despite the damp conditions. We continued walking, our footsteps the only sound in the oppressive stillness. The GPS unit occasionally lost signal, forcing us to rely on my compass and map. According to my calculations, we were approaching the creek bed where the rare orchids had been reported, but the landscape didn't match my expectations. This can't be right, I muttered, checking the map again. The creek should be just ahead, but the topography is all wrong. Marcus pointed to a depression about 50 yards ahead. Maybe it's dried up. It's been a dry summer. I frowned. The creek was spring-fed, documented consistently for decades. It shouldn't have changed course or dried up completely. But as we approached the depression, I realized it wasn't a creek bed at all. It was a long, winding trench, about 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, with smooth sides that looked almost polished. What could have made this? Marcus asked, kneeling at the edge. And I shook my head, studying the formation. Nothing natural. The walls of the trench were too uniform, too precisely carved into the forest floor. Maybe old mining activity. Even as I suggested it, I knew it was wrong. The Upper Peninsula had its share of abandoned mines, but nothing was documented in this specific area. Besides, this didn't resemble any mining operation I'd ever seen. Marcus reached down, running his fingers along the inner wall of the trench. "It's warm," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "The soil is warm to the touch." I crouched beside him, confirming his observation. Despite the cool autumn air, the walls of the trench radiated heat like they'd been baking in summer sun. But here, beneath the dense canopy where direct sunlight barely penetrated, such warmth was impossible. Impossible. "Let's take some samples," I suggested, pulling collection vials from my pack. If nothing else, the soil composition might provide some answers later. As Marcus helped collect samples, I noticed more unusual features in our surroundings. The vegetation near the trench showed signs of stress, leaves curled and browned at the edges, despite recent rainfall in the region. The ground felt unusually soft underfoot, almost spongy, as if something had altered its composition. "Look at this," Marcus called, pointing to a patch of soil about 10 feet from the trench. I moved closer, immediately recognizing what had caught his attention. More of those strange gouges, but fresher this time, the soil still crumbling at the edges, and beside them a distinct footprint, if you could call it that. It resembled no animal track I'd ever encountered. Roughly triangular, with what appeared to be 3 pointed digits extending forward and one backward, each leaving a deep impression in the soft earth. "Some kind of bird?" Marcus suggested weakly. I shook my head. The print was massive, at least 15 inches long. No bird makes tracks like this, and look at the depth. Whatever left this was heavy. I took photographs and measurements, trying to maintain a scientific detachment even as my instincts screamed that we were facing something outside my expertise. Native stories from my childhood flooded back. Tales of forest guardians and territorial spirits that took physical form when their domains were violated. "We should mark this location and report it," I said, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "Might be evidence of an undocumented species." Marcus looked skeptical. "An undocumented bipedal species in Michigan? That's unlikely." "I didn't say it was bipedal," I pointed out. "The arrangement could indicate an unusual gait pattern in a known quadruped." Even as I offered the rational explanation, we both knew it was inadequate. The prints didn't match any quadruped native to the region, and the depth suggested something far heavier than any documented wildlife. We continued our survey, finding more trenches intersecting at odd angles throughout the area, creating a complex network beneath the forest floor. Near one junction, we discovered a pile of organic matter, decomposing plant material mixed with what looked disturbingly like fur and small bones. "Owl pellets?" Marcus suggested, poking at the substance with a stick. "Too large," I replied. "And owls don't create middens like this." As we examined the area, I noticed more unusual features: trees with bark stripped in spiral patterns, rocks arranged in configurations that seemed too deliberate to be natural, patches of ground where nothing grew, forming perfect circles in the otherwise lush forest floor. The deeper we ventured, the more the anomalies accumulated. I maintained meticulous notes and photographs, clinging to scientific procedure even as my unease grew. Marcus had stopped offering explanations, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by vigilant silence. By mid-afternoon, we reached a section of forest where the canopy opened slightly, allowing shafts of sunlight to penetrate to the ground. In this improved light, I noticed something disturbing about the trees surrounding us. Many had what appeared to be deep gouges in their trunks, ranging from ground level to heights of 12 or 15 feet. The marks were similar to bare scratches, but far deeper and more systematic, often creating geometric patterns across multiple trees. "Bears marking territory?" Marcus asked, tracing one gouge with his fingertips. "Bears don't create patterns," I said, studying the markings. And these cuts are too clean. Look at the edges, which they were made with a tool. As if on cue, a distant sound echoed through the trees, a low, resonant scraping that raised the hair on my arms. It lasted only seconds, but seemed to come from all directions at once. Marcus froze. What was that? I remained still, listening intently. Could be a tree falling against another. But we both knew it wasn't. The sound had a deliberate quality, almost rhythmic, like something large dragging across a hard surface. Maybe we should head back, Marcus suggested, checking his watch. It'll be getting dark in a few hours. Under normal circumstances, I would have pressed on. Our survey was incomplete, and we'd barely collected half the data we came for, but nothing about these woods felt normal anymore. Yeah, I agreed, surprising myself. Let's circle back, follow a different route to the trailhead. Relief flashed across Marcus's face. Good plan. As we consulted the map to plot our return course, that scraping sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable in the stillness. We both looked up, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched had intensified, prickling between my shoulder blades. Let's move, I said quietly, pocketing the map. We began heading west, aiming to intersect with the main trail about a mile south of our current position. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, deadfalls blocking our path, undergrowth becoming denser and more tangled. It was as if the forest itself was trying to slow our progress. The scraping sound followed us, always just distant enough that we couldn't identify its source, but persistent. Sometimes it came from ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes from both directions simultaneously. Logic told me it was an acoustic trick, sound waves bouncing off trees and rocks, but it felt purposeful, coordinated. As we navigated a particularly dense thicket, Marcus suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing silently ahead. Through a gap in the foliage, about 30 yards distant, something moved, a dark shape, substantial but indistinct, sliding between tree trunks with an unnatural fluidity. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, squinting to catch another glimpse, but whatever it was had vanished. "Probably a bear," I said, not believing it myself. It was standing upright. The statement hung between us, neither of us willing to explore its implications. We adjusted our course slightly, giving the area a wide berth. The sounds continued intermittently, sometimes accompanied by a deeper vibration that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. With each passing minute, the forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath becoming visible in the cooling air. According to my watch, it was only 4 p.m., but it felt like evening was closing in rapidly. We increased our pace, pushing through the underbrush with growing urgency. My mental map of the area had become unreliable. Landmarks didn't match my expectations. Distances seemed compressed or expanded unpredictably. Even the compass behaved erratically, the needle swinging wildly before settling in directions that contradicted my instinctual sense of orientation. "I think we're lost," Marcus finally said, stating what I'd been reluctant to admit. "Not lost," I countered. "Just temporarily disoriented. The trail has to be west of us." But west had become a meaningless concept in these woods. Suffixed in these woods. The sun was now completely obscured by clouds, and the forest had taken on a uniform dimness that erased shadows and depth perception. We pushed on, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound between the massive trees. The scraping sounds had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that felt even more threatening. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, calculating. As we rounded a bend in the trail, Marcus suddenly stopped, his body tensing. "Clyde," he whispered, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. About 50 yards ahead, the trees opened into what appeared to be a clearing, but what drew our attention was what surrounded it. Arranged in a perfect circle around the perimeter, spaced at regular intervals, were what looked like cairns, stacks of stones and other materials rising from the forest floor. But as we drew closer, I realized with growing horror that they weren't just stones. They were bones, so stones. Countless bones of various sizes meticulously stacked and arranged into tower-like structures that rose 8 or 9 feet from the ground. Some appeared to be animal remains, deer antlers, wolf skulls, the curved ribs of large mammals. But others were unmistakably human, femurs, pelvic bones, craniums with empty eye sockets staring outward from these macabre monuments. Jesus, Marcus breathed, then caught himself. I couldn't respond, my throat constricting as I took in the scale of the ossuary before us. There were dozens of these bone towers, each seemingly arranged according to some incomprehensible pattern. And at the center of the clearing stood something else, a structure different from the others, larger and more complex. "We need to leave," I said, finding my voice at last. But even as I spoke, that scraping sound returned, louder, closer, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. Marcus and I exchanged a single glance, understanding passing between us without words. We turned and began retracing our steps, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the undergrowth. Behind us, something emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. I caught only a glimpse, a dark shape, massive and distorted, moving with a terrible, purposeful grace toward the central structure. I didn't look back again, focusing solely on the path ahead and the increasingly desperate need to find our way out of these haunted woods before nightfall. The afternoon had descended into a premature twilight by the time we'd put a quarter-mile between ourselves and that horrific bone-lined clearing. My heart hammered against my ribs as we pushed through the underbrush, no longer concerned with stealth, focused only on distance. Marcus stayed close behind me, his breathing ragged and panicked. "What the hell did we just see?" he gasped when we finally paused, sheltering in the shadow of a massive fallen oak. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent response. Nothing in my 15 years of forestry work had prepared me for the grotesque display we'd witnessed. Those weren't hunting trophies or the random accumulation of scavenger kills. They were deliberate constructions, monuments built with methodical precision. "We need to contact the authorities," Marcus continued, his voice cracking. "Those were human remains back there. This could be some kind of serial killer dumping ground." The rational explanation should have been comforting, but we both knew it fell short. No killer, no matter how deranged, could account for the scale of what we'd seen or the impossible arrangement of those bone structures, some balanced in configurations that defied physics. First we focus on getting out," I said, checking my compass again. The needle continued its erratic spinning, rendering it useless. We follow the declining slope. Water flows downhill, and the creek feeds into the main river. If we find water, we find our way out. Marcus nodded, clinging to this practical plan. We set off again, moving as quickly as the dense undergrowth allowed. The forest had changed again, the massive ancient trees giving way to younger, closely packed pines that clawed at our clothing and scratched our exposed skin. The ground beneath our feet had become increasingly soft and damp, suggesting we were indeed moving toward lower elevation. That's when we heard it again, that wet, dragging sound, now accompanied by a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It came from behind us, moving parallel to our course but staying just out of sight among the trees. "It's following us," Marcus whispered, his face pale in the fading light. "Keep moving," I urged, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Don't look back." We increased our pace, nearly jogging now despite the treacherous footing. The sounds pursued us, sometimes falling behind, sometimes circling ahead, as if our tracker was toying with us, herding us in a specific direction. I realized with growing dread that we might be walking into a trap, but the alternative, stopping or changing course, seemed equally dangerous. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we stumbled upon what I first took to be salvation, a small wooden structure nestled among the trees ahead. As we drew closer, I recognized it as an old trapper's cabin, weathered and apparently abandoned, but still standing. And Thank God, Marcus breathed. Maybe there's a radio or supplies or... Wait, I cautioned, studying the cabin with growing unease. Something about it felt wrong. The angle of the roof slightly off, the proportions subtly distorted. And surrounding it, barely visible in the gathering gloom, were more of those strange gouges in the earth, forming concentric circles around the structure. But we had little choice. The sky had darkened to deep purple, and genuine night would fall within minutes. Quota fall within minutes. Whatever was tracking us through the woods, I had no desire to face it in darkness. We'll check it out, I decided. But stay alert. We approached cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at my belt, a woefully inadequate weapon against whatever had constructed those bone towers, but better than nothing. The cabin's single window was dark, its glass long since shattered. The wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a high-pitched whine that seemed obscenely loud in the forest's silence. The interior was a single room, dark and musty. Marcus fumbled with his flashlight, and the beam revealed Spartan furnishings. A rusted metal cot against one wall, a small table with one broken leg, a cast-iron stove blackened with decades of use. Check for anything useful, I instructed, moving to the windows to secure them as best I could. Marcus swept his light across the room, stopping suddenly on the far wall. "Clyde," he called, his voice tight. "You need to see this." I turned, following his beam to where it illuminated the rough-hewn logs of the back wall. Carved into the wood, covering nearly the entire surface, were symbols, hundreds of them, overlapping and interconnected. Some resembled letters from alphabets I couldn't identify. Others were pictographs depicting crude humanoid figures with elongated limbs and misshapen heads. But most disturbing were the larger designs that incorporated these symbols into sprawling mandalas of incomprehensible complexity. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his light tracing the patterns. "Some kind of code." I shook my head slowly. Some of the symbols tugged at my memory, similar to but distinct from petroglyphs I'd seen on Anishinaabe territories. These carried a different energy. The lines cut deeper and more frantic, as if carved in desperate haste or manic fervor. I don't know, I admitted. But I don't think this cabin belonged to a trapper. Marcus continued examining the wall, his academic curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "The patterns seem to radiate from this central figure," he noted, pointing to a large symbol that resembled an inverted tree with writhing roots extending upward instead of branches. "Almost like a map." Or he never finished the sentence. Outside, perhaps 20 yards from the cabin, something heavy moved through the underbrush, branches snapping, earth compressing under substantial weight. We both froze, listening as the sound circled the clearing, methodical and unhurried. "Kill the light," whispered. Marcus switched off his flashlight, plunging us into near-total darkness. Only the faintest gray illumination filtered through the broken window, barely enough to make out each other's silhouettes. We stood motionless, hardly daring to breathe as the sounds outside grew closer, then stopped directly in front of the cabin door. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, pregnant with malevolent anticipation. I could feel Marcus trembling beside me, hear the shallow, rapid pattern of his breathing. My own heart pounded so violently I was certain it must be audible outside. Then came a new sound, a low, wet clicking that might have been laughter if filtered through a throat never meant for human speech. It rose and fell in a deliberate rhythm, almost musical in its obscene cadence. Something scraped against the outer wall, testing the structure's integrity. "The door," I mouthed silently to Marcus, gesturing toward the entrance. It had no lock, no bar, nothing to prevent whatever lurked outside from entering. Understanding immediately, Marcus moved with me toward the door. We pressed our shoulders against it, bracing our feet against the uneven floorboards. The wood felt thin and insubstantial beneath my palms, hardly a barrier at all. Outside, the clicking stopped. For several heartbeats, there was only silence, heavy with expectation. Then the door bulged inward with terrific force, nearly throwing us off our feet. We pushed back, straining against the pressure. Wood splintered along the frame as another impact threatened to tear the door from its hinges. "The table!" I hissed. "Wedge it against the door." Marcus scrambled for the broken table, dragging it across the floor. Together, we tilted it against the door, bracing its legs against the opposite wall to create a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't hold against determined assault, but it might buy us precious minutes. Precious minutes. No sooner had we secured the table than something struck the cabin's side wall with such force that the entire structure shuddered. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the assault continued, moving methodically around the perimeter, testing for weaknesses. "There must be another way out," Marcus whispered desperately, scanning the cabin's interior. "I spotted a small trapdoor in the ceiling, likely access to a storage loft." I pushed against the trapdoor, relieved when it gave way with minimal resistance. Pulling myself up, I found a small storage space beneath the peaked roof, empty save for a few moldering burlap sacks. Most importantly, part of the roof had collapsed, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. "Come on," I called down softly, extending my arm to pull Marcus up. He had just grasped my hand when the cabin's back wall exploded inward, showering the room with splintered wood and debris. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something massive filling the newly created breach, a shape of impossible proportions, its outline seeming to warp and shift even as I stared at it. 2 points of cold luminescence glowed where eyes should be, fixing on us with predatory intensity. Marcus screamed, a sound of pure animal terror that cut through the night. His grip on my hand tightened convulsively as I strained to pull him up, but something had seized his legs, dragging him backward with inexorable strength. I braced myself against the trapdoor frame, pulling with all my might, feeling the tendons in my shoulder threaten to tear from the effort. For one horrible moment, we were suspended in equilibrium, Marcus stretched between my desperate grip and the unseen force below. Then his hand slipped from mine, slick with sweat and terror, and he fell back into the darkness of the cabin. His scream transformed into something worse, a bubbling, liquid sound abruptly cut short. Instinct took over. I scrambled through the roof opening, heedless of the jagged edges that tore at my clothing and skin, emerging onto the sloped roof and sliding down to drop into the clearing beyond. The night air hit my lungs like ice water, shocking me into motion. I ran blindly into the forest, pursued by sounds no human throat could produce, a symphony of clicks, hisses, and that terrible wet laughter echoing through the trees. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst, stumbling through underbrush and crashing into low-hanging branches that lashed my face and tore at my eyes. Behind me, always behind me, came that dragging sound. Patient, relentless, drawing incrementally closer with each passing minute. Eventually, I collapsed at the base of a massive pine, physically incapable of moving further. Blood trickled from dozens of scratches across my face and hands. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it in a hidden root hole, leaning against the rough bark. I strained to hear any sounds of pursuit, but the forest had gone silent again. That expectant, watching silence that had preceded each encounter. As my breathing gradually steadied, rational thought began to reassert itself. Marcus was gone, that much was certain. The realization brought a wave of nausea and self-loathing. I had let go. I had fled. Whatever happened to him in that cabin, I had abandoned him to face it alone. But beneath the guilt lay a more pragmatic concern. I was hopelessly lost in these woods, without light, without reliable navigation, and with something hunting me that defied all natural explanation. Mani. My only hope lay in finding my way back to the trail before dawn, before exhaustion rendered me incapable of movement. With shaking hands, I checked my pockets, taking inventory of my meager resources. The compass was useless, but I still had my knife, a lighter, and half a protein bar. No flashlight, no map, no water. It would have to be enough. Rising painfully to my feet, I oriented myself as best I could without stars or landmarks, choosing a direction that I hoped would lead toward lower elevation. As I prepared to move, a sound stopped me cold, that familiar wet scraping now directly behind me. I turned slowly, knife clutched in my trembling hand, and faced the thing that had emerged from between the trees just yards away. In the darkness, its form remained mercifully indistinct, a hulking silhouette of impossible angles and proportions. Its shoulders too broad and jointed wrongly, its limbs too long and articulated in places limbs shouldn't bend. But its eyes, those I could see clearly, 2 points of phosphorescent light that contained an intelligence as ancient and cold as the void between stars. It regarded me with those terrible eyes, head tilting at an angle that suggested curiosity rather than imminent attack. Then it made that clicking sound again, a complex pattern that almost seemed like language. One elongated limb extended toward me, ending in what might have been fingers or claws or something for which human language has no adequate term. I raised my knife, a futile gesture against this creature, but defiance was all I had left. It paused, those luminous eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a motion too swift to follow, it lunged forward, and the night dissolved into pain and darkness, and the sound of my own screaming. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost meaning in those dark woods, minutes stretching into what felt like hours as I crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs. My lungs burned, each breath tearing through my chest like fire. My legs moved mechanically, driven by pure animal terror rather than conscious will. The thing, I still struggle to call it a creature, as that word implies something natural, something that belongs in our world, pursued me with relentless patience. Sometimes I could hear it directly behind me, branches snapping under its weight. Other times the sounds came from my left or right, as if it were hurting me in a specific direction. Most terrifying were the moments of complete silence when I knew it was still there, watching, calculating, toying with me. I had seen it clearly only once, in that moment outside the cabin, and my mind rebelled against forming a coherent image from those fragments of perception. Its proportions followed no natural blueprint. Too many joints, limbs that bent at impossible angles, hide that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. Even now, years later, I can only describe impressions, the suggestion of a massive, hunched form, limbs too long and articulated wrongly, a head, if it could be called that seemed to change shape as it moved. What remains most vivid are those eyes, cold points of luminescence that held an intelligence so alien and ancient that meeting their gaze felt like staring into an abyss of evolutionary divergence, a branch of life that developed in parallel to our own but followed radically different principles. As I fled through the darkened forest, my mind cycled through explanations, each less plausible than the last. A bear deformed by radiation or chemical exposure. An undocumented predator, somehow overlooked by science despite its size and distinctive characteristics. A hallucination induced by toxic spores from some rare fungus we'd disturbed. None of these rationalities held up against what I'd witnessed. The methodical arrangement of those bone structures, the symbols carved into the cabin walls, the obvious intelligence behind its pursuit. This was no mindless predator operating on instinct. It was hunting me with purpose and strategy. I stumbled into a shallow creek, the icy water shocking me momentarily out of my panic. Water. Direction. Following the flow would lead downhill, eventually to larger bodies of water and perhaps civilization. It was the most basic rule of wilderness survival. One eye clung to now like a lifeline. Splashing downstream, I used the water to mask my scent and sound, moving as quickly as the slippery rocks allowed. For a brief period, the pursuit sounds faded, giving me hope that I'd gained some advantage. Then I heard it again, that wet, dragging sound, now moving parallel to the creek, keeping pace effortlessly despite the rough terrain. The creek broadened, deepening in places to small pools where the water reflected the faint starlight that penetrated the canopy. In one such pool, I caught a glimpse of movement beneath the surface, something large displacing water as it passed just inches below where I stood. I froze, watching in horror as the disturbance circled my legs before continuing downstream, faster than any fish or normal aquatic creature could move. It was in the water. It was in the goddamn water. I scrambled up the bank, abandoning the creek strategy and plunging back into the forest. My direction was now completely arbitrary. Away. Just away from that thing that seemed capable of navigating any environment with equal facility. As I pushed through a particularly dense thicket, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first into the leaf litter. Pain shot through my ankle, accompanied by the distinct pop of overstressed tendons. I bit back a scream, knowing it would only hasten the inevitable, and tried to stand. My ankle buckled immediately, unable to bear weight. I was done. No more running, no more escape. The realization brought a strange calm, the fatalistic acceptance of prey that knows the chase is over. I dragged myself to the base of a massive oak, propping my back against its trunk and drawing my hunting knife, a pathetic defense, but I wouldn't meet my end cowering. The forest had gone silent again, that watching silence that preceded each appearance of the creature, ends of the creature. I strained my eyes against the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it would emerge. Nothing moved among the trees. No branches swayed, no undergrowth rustled. Yet I could feel its presence, a heaviness in the air like the pressure before a violent storm. What do you want? I called out, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. What the hell are you? No response came, but the silence itself seemed to deepen, as if the very air were holding its breath. Then, gradually, I became aware of a vibration. Not a sound exactly, but a physical sensation passing through the ground into my body. It increased in intensity until the leaf litter around me danced with its force, small stones bouncing on the forest floor. From the darkness directly ahead, something moved toward me, a shape blacker than the surrounding night, dimensions shifting as it approached. It stopped about 15 feet away, just at the edge of visibility, its form seeming to blur and refocus constantly, as if my eyes couldn't properly process what they were seeing. Those luminous eyes fixed on me with terrible intelligence. Convergence. The thing made that clicking sound again, a complex pattern that rose and fell in distinct phrases. Then it extended one elongated limb, pointing first at me, then at the ground beside it, in what seemed unmistakably like a command. I tightened my grip on the knife, preparing for its rush. But it remained stationary, repeating the pointing gesture with deliberate patience, as if dealing with a particularly slow child. After several repetitions, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't preparing to attack, it was communicating. It wanted me to approach it voluntarily. No, I said, the word barely audible even to my own ears. The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, those eyes narrowing slightly. Then it made a new sound, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and reverberate directly through my skeleton. With it came a sensation of crushing pressure, as if the air itself were compressing around me, forcing the breath from my lungs. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, as I struggled to breathe. The knife fell from nerveless fingers as I clawed at my throat, fighting against the invisible force constricting it. Just as consciousness began to fade, the pressure released suddenly, leaving me gasping and retching on the forest floor. A warning, then. A demonstration of power. The creature remained motionless, watching my recovery with what might have been scientific curiosity. When I had regained some semblance of composure, it repeated the pointing gesture, more emphatically this time. The message was clear: follow willingly or be compelled by force. With no viable alternatives, I struggled to my feet, wincing as my injured ankle protested the movement. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, I limped forward, stopping several yards from the creature. Even at this distance, its wrongness was overwhelming. The way its outline seemed to shimmer and distort, as if its physical form were merely an approximation of something my mind couldn't properly comprehend. It turned and began moving into the forest, pausing to ensure I followed. Each step was agony, my ankle throbbing in time with my racing heart. But the memory of that crushing force kept me moving. We proceeded through the darkness, the creature occasionally adjusting its pace to accommodate my labored progress. Our destination became apparent as we approached a familiar location. The clearing ringed with bone structures that Marcus and I had discovered earlier. But now, in the deeper darkness, the clearing had transformed. Those bone cairns seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence, casting the entire area in sickly blue-green light. At the center, where earlier I'd glimpsed some larger structure, now stood something that defied rational description. It resembled a doorway or arch, constructed from interlocking bones of various sizes, rising perhaps 12 feet from the forest floor. Within the arch was not the expected view of the forest beyond, but a darkness deeper than the surrounding night, a void that seemed to bend the very light around it, creating an optical distortion that made my eyes water and my head throb when I tried to focus on it. The creature guided me to the edge of the clearing, then stopped, making that complex clicking sound again. Other sounds answered from the darkness, similar patterns coming from multiple directions. As my eyes adjusted to the eerie illumination, I realized with mounting dread that we were not alone. Shapes moved among the trees surrounding the clearing. 5 additional creatures of similar proportion to my captor, emerging from hiding places that should have been too small to conceal their bulk. They converged on the clearing, moving with that same fluid grace that suggested joints and musculature arranged according to principles entirely foreign to earthly biology. As they entered the phosphorescent light, I caught glimpses of their forms, each similar in general shape, but with distinct variations, like different breeds of the same impossible species. Some moved on what appeared to be multiple limbs, others propelled themselves with undulating lower bodies. All shared those luminous eyes filled with cold intelligence. They formed a loose circle around me, exchanging those clicking communications in patterns that suggested language. One approached, extending a limb toward my face. I flinched back, but it moved with blinding speed, seizing my jaw with appendages that felt like wet leather stretched over steel. It turned my head from side to side, examining me with clinical detachment. Another approached, this one smaller but moving with greater agility. It circled me, prodding at my clothing and equipment with evident curiosity. When it reached toward my chest pocket, where I kept my Forestry Service ID, I instinctively moved to protect it. The creature reacted instantly, producing that same resonant vibration that had earlier constricted my breathing. This time, the pressure localized in my outstretched arm, forcing it down to my side with irresistible strength. Message received. I remained motionless as it extracted the ID, turning the laminated card in its elongated digits, studying the photo and text with apparent interest. After a moment, it made a sharp clicking sound and passed the ID to another creature, which examined it similarly before discarding it carelessly on the forest floor. Throughout this inspection, I fought to maintain some semblance of scientific observation, clinging to professional detachment as a shield against paralyzing terror. These were intelligent beings, capable of complex communication and coordinated action. They displayed curiosity, methodical behavior, and clear social organization. Whatever they were, whether undiscovered terrestrial species or something far stranger, they were not mindless predators. This realization offered cold comfort as they completed their examination and began herding me toward that impossible arch at the clearing's center. As we approached, the darkness within it seemed to deepen, shifting and swirling like a liquid void. The air grew colder, carrying a smell I can only describe as the absence of smell, a negative space where normal sensory input should exist. My captor pushed me forward until I stood directly before the arch, close enough to feel a subtle pull from the darkness within, as if it generated its own gravity. The clicking communications intensified, taking on a rhythmic quality that reminded me disturbingly of chanting. The bone structures surrounding the clearing began to pulse in time with this rhythm, their phosphorescence brightening and dimming in coordinated waves. I knew with sudden, absolute certainty that they intended me to enter that arch, that terrible doorway to wherever these creatures originated. And I knew with equal certainty that doing so would mean the end of anything recognizable as human existence. In that moment of clarity, survival instinct overrode pain and fear. I twisted suddenly, breaking away from my distracted captor and lunging toward the gap between two of the surrounding creatures. My injured ankle screamed in protest but held long enough for me to stagger into the tree line, blind panic lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, those clicking voices rose in what could only be alarm, followed by the sounds of pursuit crashing through the undergrowth. I ran without direction or strategy, driven by the primal need to put distance between myself and that abominable doorway. Each step sent daggers of pain up my leg, but fear pushed me forward, deeper into the lightless forest. I don't know how long I fled or how I evaded recapture in my injured state. Perhaps they expected me to tire quickly. Perhaps something about the forest itself helped conceal my trail. Or perhaps, in their alien psychology, my desperate flight constituted some form of test or trial, amusing to observe rather than immediately thwart. Whatever the reason, I eventually found myself alone in the darkness, leaning against a tree trunk, my body trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. The pursuit sounds had receded, replaced by the normal nocturnal chorus of insects and wind through branches. I had escaped, temporarily at least. With my ankle now swollen to twice its normal size, continuing to run was impossible. My only option was to find shelter and hope to survive until daylight, when perhaps the creature's activities would be limited. In the dim starlight filtering through the canopy, I spotted a dense thicket nearby, not ideal protection, but better than remaining exposed. I crawled into the center of the brambles, heedless of the thorns tearing at my clothing and skin, and curled into the smallest target possible. There, surrounded by tangled vegetation, I waited for dawn, straining to detect any sound of approaching predators while fighting the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. As the adrenaline ebbed, the full horror of the night's events crashed down upon me. Marcus was gone, taken or killed by these things for purposes I couldn't begin to comprehend. I had been examined like a laboratory specimen, nearly forced through some kind of doorway to an unknown destination. And somewhere in these woods, at least 6 of those creatures still moved with terrible purpose, perhaps even now searching for their escaped subject. Sleep was impossible, yet my battered body demanded rest. I drifted in and out of a twilight state, jerking fully awake at every snapping twig or rustling leaf, certain each time that discovery was imminent. During one such period of semi-consciousness, I became aware of a gradual lightening of the forest. Not dawn yet, but the first hint that night was finally retreating. With this faint illumination came an unexpected sound, distant but unmistakable, a vehicle engine. somewhere far below my position. Civilization, safety, or at least the chance of it. Gathering the last reserves of my strength, I crawled from the thicket and oriented myself toward the sound. The forest sloped downward in that direction, suggesting a road in the valley below. If I could reach it before the creatures found me again, I might survive to tell this impossible story. And so began the most painful journey of my life. Half crawling, half dragging myself down the forested slope, using trees for support and crude walking sticks fashioned from fallen branches. Each movement was an exercise in agony, my injured ankle now completely useless, forcing me to essentially hop on one leg while balancing with my makeshift crutches. The forest seemed to conspire against my progress, throwing up obstacles at every turn: dense underbrush, hidden depressions, fallen trees too large to easily circumvent. Yet the sound of engines grew gradually louder, confirming I was moving in the right direction. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions for the hunted, began to flicker within me. As gray pre-dawn light filtered through the trees, I caught glimpses of what appeared to be a paved surface through the thinning forest ahead. A road, perhaps a quarter-mile distant. So close. Yet in my condition, it might as well have been 10 miles. I pressed on, abandoning caution for speed, making more noise than was wise in my desperate push towards safety. The road was now clearly visible, a 2-lane highway cutting through the valley below, with occasional vehicles passing in the early morning light. 200 yards, 100 yards, 150. The forest was thinning, transitioning to scrubby second growth near the roadside. 100 yards. I could distinguish individual vehicles now, mostly logging trucks and the occasional passenger car. 75 yards. So that's when I heard it again, that wet, dragging sound directly behind me. I didn't need to turn to know what followed, could feel those luminous eyes boring into my back with predatory intensity. It had found me, tracked me through miles of dense forest despite my desperate attempts at evasion. No. 50 yards from safety, I made a final desperate push, abandoning my makeshift crutches and simply hurling myself forward, half falling down the remaining slope. Behind me, the creature closed the distance with terrifying speed, no longer bothering with stealth. I could hear branches snapping under its weight, feel the ground vibrate with its approach. 25 yards. The road was right there, morning sunlight glinting off the asphalt. A logging truck approached from the south, moving at considerable speed. If I could just reach the roadside in time to flag it down, 10 yards. I was crawling now, my body having finally surrendered to exhaustion and injury. The creature was almost upon me. I could smell its strange acrid odor, hear its clicking communication, presumably calling to its companions. 5 yards. The truck was passing, its driver oblivious to the life or death drama unfolding just beyond his field of vision. I summoned the last dregs of my strength, raised myself to my knees, and waved frantically, a hoarse cry tearing from my raw throat. The truck's brakes squealed as the driver spotted me, the massive vehicle slowing and pulling onto the shoulder perhaps 50 yards beyond my position. Behind me, the creature hesitated, suddenly confronted with potential witnesses and the harsh light of dawn. I crawled the final distance to the road's edge, collapsing onto the gravel shoulder as the truck driver jogged back toward me, shouting questions I couldn't process through the roaring in my ears. I turned my head, seeking a final glimpse of my pursuer, but the tree line stood empty now. The creature had vanished, retreating back into the depths of the forest from which it had emerged. As the driver reached me, his weathered face contorting with alarm at my condition, I felt consciousness finally slipping away. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was looking past him, back toward those accursed woods, and seeing movement among the distant trees, not the creature itself, but the subtle shifting of branches that suggested something large withdrawing deeper into shadow. Then there was only blackness and the blessed release of oblivion. I awoke to the antiseptic smell of a hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, and the dull throb of injuries partially masked by medication. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh illumination a stark contrast to the darkness of Solchwa Point. For several disoriented moments, I couldn't reconcile these surroundings with my last conscious memories. Nature. A nurse noticed my stirring and approached, checking my vitals with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back," she said, adjusting my foredrip. "You've been out for nearly 20 hours. Doctor will want to know you're awake." "Where?" My voice emerged as a croak, my throat raw from screaming and dehydration. "Marquette General Hospital," she replied, offering a plastic cup of water. "Logging truck brought you in yesterday morning. You were in pretty rough shape." As awareness returned, so did the memories, the bone towers, the cabin, Marcus's scream, those luminous eyes watching from the darkness. I tried to sit up, panic surging through me. There was someone with me. Marcus, the intern. The nurse gently pushed me back against the pillows. "Easy now. You were alone when they found you. Highway Patrol sent a team to search the area after you were brought in, but I haven't heard anything about finding anyone else." Of course they hadn't. Whatever fate had befallen Marcus, it wasn't one that would leave evidence easily discovered by a routine search party. A hollow ache spread through my chest, guilt mingling with the physical pain of my injuries. A doctor arrived soon after, a grave-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Rivera. She examined me thoroughly, cataloging my injuries with clinical detachment. Severe sprain to the right ankle with partial tendon tear, multiple lacerations and contusions, mild hypothermia, dehydration, exhaustion. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Red Bear," she concluded, making notes on her tablet. "Can you tell me what happened out there?" The question hung in the air between us. What could I possibly say? That ancient inhuman creatures stalked Michigan's forests, building monuments from bones and opening doorways to somewhere else. That they had taken or killed my intern and nearly done the same to me. The truth would sound like the ravings of a man in shock or suffering hallucinations. Got separated from my partner during a forestry survey. I said finally. Fell and injured my ankle. Got disoriented trying to find my way out. Dr. Rivera studied me over her glasses, clearly recognizing the inadequacy of this explanation, but professional enough not to press. "The police will want to take a statement once you're more stable. They've organized a search for your missing colleague." I nodded, knowing the search would yield nothing. "When can I leave?" "We'd like to keep you under observation for at least another day. That ankle needs proper immobilization, and we're still concerned about potential infection in some of those deeper lacerations." After she left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened and what might come next. Would the creatures remain in their territory, or would they pursue me now that I'd seen them? What was that doorway in the clearing, and where did it lead? And most troublingly, why had they released me when capture had seemed certain? My thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a police officer, a young state trooper who introduced himself as Officer Kapinski. He pulled up a chair beside my bed, notebook in hand. "Mr. Red Bear, I understand you're still recovering, but we need some information to help locate your missing colleague. I provided Marcus's full name and what little I knew of his background. Graduate student at Northern Michigan University, studying conservation biology, assigned as my intern for the Solchwa Point survey. When asked about the circumstances of our separation, I repeated the sanitized version I'd given Dr. Rivera, adding fabricated details about areas we'd already searched to direct the rescue teams away from the clearing and the cabin. "And you have no idea what might have happened to him?" Kapinski pressed, clearly sensing omissions in my account. I shook my head. "We got separated in the dark. I called for him, but..." I let the sentence trail off, not trusting myself to elaborate convincingly. The officer made a few more notes, then closed his notebook. "We'll continue searching, but I should warn you, those woods are extensive, and if he's injured and unable to signal..." He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. After Kopinski left, a new visitor arrived. My supervisor from the forestry department, Alan Richards. He looked haggard, his normally neat appearance disheveled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "Jesus, Clyde," he said, dropping heavily into the chair. "What the hell happened out there?" Again, I provided the simplified version, but Alan knew me too well to accept it fully. We'd worked together for nearly a decade, and he'd never known me to get disoriented in familiar territory, regardless of conditions. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "the university is raising hell about their missing student. There's talk of negligence, inadequate safety protocols. I need to know exactly what went down." I met his gaze steadily. "I told you what happened, Alan. We got separated. I got injured. End of story." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "The area's been placed off limits pending the investigation. No one's allowed in until they either find the kid or, well, until the search is called off." "Good," I said, perhaps too emphatically. "That's probably for the best." Alan's eyebrows rose slightly at my tone, but he didn't pursue it. Instead, he switched to practicalities: my medical leave, paperwork for the incident report, arrangements for my transportation home once discharged. Throughout the conversation, I could sense his unasked questions, his awareness that I was withholding significant information. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Whatever really happened out there, Clyde, was it something that might endanger the search teams?" The question caught me off guard. I considered lying, then decided against. These people were walking into danger blindly. They deserved at least a warning, however cryptic. "Tell them to stay out of the old growth section near the creek," I said carefully. "And if they find a cabin, don't enter it. Just don't." Alan nodded slowly, accepting this bizarre advice without further question, a testament to our years of mutual trust. "I'll pass it along. Rest up, Clyde." After he left, I spent hours staring at the window, watching daylight fade into dusk. Sleep evaded me, despite the sedatives coursing through my system. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bone towers, that impossible doorway, those luminous eyes watching with alien intelligence. The next day brought a parade of additional visitors. More police officers, a representative from the university asking pointed questions about the circumstances of Marcus's disappearance, even a reporter from the local paper, whom I refused to speak with. By afternoon, I had retreated into monosyllabic responses, claiming exhaustion to avoid detailed questioning. Dr. Rivera, sensing my deteriorating mental state, limited further visits, and arranged for a consultation with the hospital's psychiatric department. The psychiatrist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Chen, recognized the signs of acute trauma and recommended against pushing me for a complete account of events until I had time to process the experience. "Whatever happened in those woods clearly left psychological wounds alongside the physical ones," she explained to the frustrated detective who had replaced Officer Kopinski. "Forcing him to relive it now could cause additional trauma." I was discharged 3 days later, my ankle immobilized in a walking boot, with prescriptions for pain medication, antibiotics, and sleep aids. Alan arranged for a department vehicle to transport me back to my cabin near Munizing, where I lived alone, except for an aging retriever named Scout. The search for Marcus continued for another 2 weeks before being officially classified as a recovery operation rather than a rescue. They never found his body. The official report eventually concluded he had likely fallen into one of the numerous sinkholes that pockmarked the karst landscape of Sulchua Point. His remains perhaps washed into the extensive underground cave system that honeycombed the region. I didn't correct this assumption. What purpose would it serve, other than to destroy my credibility and career? Who would believe the truth? And more dangerously, who might be inspired to investigate that clearing, that cabin, those bone towers for themselves? Instead, I retreated into isolation, taking extended medical leave that gradually transformed into a desk position, analyzing survey data rather than collecting it. I never returned to fieldwork, citing my injured ankle as the reason. The truth that I couldn't bear to enter any forest, knowing what might lurk in its depths, remained my secret. In the months that followed, I conducted my own investigation, researching historical records and native legends associated with Solchwa Point, Oitakatola. The area, I discovered, had a long history of disappearances dating back to the earliest European exploration. Native stories spoke of it as a thin place where entities from elsewhere could cross into our world, a description that aligned disturbingly with that bone-framed doorway I had witnessed. Most tellingly, I found references in Chippewa oral histories to the Watchers at the Threshold, beings who guarded certain sacred or forbidden locations against human trespass. The descriptions, while cloaked in metaphor and spiritual language, contained elements that matched my experience. Creatures of fluid form with too many joints and cold eyes, their preference for darkness, their ability to move through water and earth with equal facility, their construction of spirit houses from the bones of their victims. These discoveries brought no comfort, only confirmation that what I had encountered was known to indigenous peoples long before European settlement. The creatures were not new to these lands. They had always been here, allowing human civilization to expand around their territories while maintaining their own hidden domains. 6 months after the incident, I received an unexpected package at my office, a battered digital camera in a sealed evidence bag, accompanied by a note from Alan. Found in the search area, it read, technically should go to his family, but thought you might want to see it first. Marcus's camera. I stared at it for hours before finding the courage to extract the memory card and view its contents. Most images were what you would expect from a forestry survey: plant specimens, soil samples, GPS-tagged landscapes. Then came the photographs from that final day. The strange gouges in the earth. The unnatural trench with its polished walls, twisted trees with their geometric scars, and finally, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable, a glimpse of one of the bone towers at the clearing's edge. But the most disturbing image was the last one, taken, according to the timestamp, just moments before we fled from the clearing. It showed a section of forest where nothing appeared to be present, just trees and undergrowth. Yet in the upper corner, barely visible, was a distortion in the air, a warping of light and space around what seemed to be empty forest. When I enlarged this section and enhanced the contrast, I nearly dropped the camera. Within that distortion, barely perceptible, was the outline of one of the creatures, its form transparent and wavering, but its eyes clear and focused directly on the camera lens. It had been there watching us before we even knew we were being stalked. I deleted the images, then physically destroyed the memory card, breaking it into pieces and disposing of them in separate locations. The empty camera I returned to Alan, claiming the card had been damaged and unreadable. He accepted this without question, perhaps relieved to be spared whatever traumatic images it might have contained. Life gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. I moved to a different town, took a new position with the parks department that kept me firmly behind a desk, began seeing a therapist under the guise of processing grief for my lost colleague. I never mentioned the true nature of what I'd witnessed in those woods, framing my trauma in terms of survivor's guilt and the stress of the ordeal. Years passed. The nightmares receded from nightly terrors to occasional disturbances. I developed routines that allowed me to function: medication, therapy, careful avoidance of triggers like dense forests or darkness. I even managed to form relationships, though none lasted. The weight of my unshared experience created a barrier too substantial to overcome. Then, last month, I received a letter. No return address, just my name and current location inscribed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single page containing a crude drawing of one of the bone towers and Beneath it, coordinates for a location in the western Upper Peninsula, far from Solchwa Point, but similarly remote. Below these, a message. They're spreading. More doorways opening. Need your help. I burned the letter immediately, but its contents had already scarred themselves into my memory. Someone else had encountered these creatures, recognized what they were, and somehow connected them to me. The implications were terrifying. Not just that the entities were expanding their territory, but that knowledge of them was spreading among humans. I've spent weeks debating what to do with this information. Report it to authorities? They would dismiss it as the ravings of a traumatized mind, or worse, investigate and send more innocent people into danger. Ignore it? Ignore it? How could I live with myself if others suffered what Marcus did, knowing I might have prevented it? In the end, I've chosen this middle path, recording my experience in full, finally giving honest voice to what I witnessed in those accursed woods. I don't expect to be believed. I don't seek validation or even understanding. This account exists solely as warning and testimony to be discovered should others encounter these entities and seek answers. As for me, I've made my decision. Tomorrow I leave for the coordinates provided in that anonymous letter. I go prepared this time, not with weapons, which proved useless against these creatures, but with knowledge. I've spent years researching similar phenomena, corresponding discreetly with indigenous elders and cryptozoological researchers, gathering what fragmentary information exists about these entities and their potential vulnerabilities. I harbor no illusions about my chances of success or even survival. But Marcus deserves justice, or at least understanding. And if these doorways are indeed proliferating, someone must document them, must understand what comes through them and why. If you're reading this, it likely means I haven't returned. In that case, heed my warning. There are places in this world where reality thins, where things from elsewhere can cross into our domain. Solchwa Point is one such place. There are others, their numbers potentially growing. Respect the old boundaries, the forgotten territories, the places where even animals fall silent. And if you find yourself in deep woods and sense that watching silence, if you discover strange markings or structures that defy natural explanation, do what I failed to do 17 years ago. Run. Run without looking back. Run until you reach light and civilization and the comforting din of human activity. Because in the dark spaces between trees, in the shadows that move against the wind, in the silence that falls too suddenly across a forest path, they are watching, waiting, their cold, luminous eyes fixed on the next unwitting trespasser to cross their threshold. And unlike me, you may not be allowed to escape to tell your tale. My name is Kennedy Walkingstick, and I am the last ranger of Whispers Creek National Forest. The Cherokee blood that flows through my veins carries 7 generations of forest guardians, each one teaching the next the woods hold more than trees and wildlife. My grandmother used to say the forest remembers everything, every footstep, every scream, every soul that never found its way home. The morning of September 15th started like any other. I was checking the trail markers near Devil's Backbone Ridge when my radio crackled to life. Kennedy, we've got another missing hiker. College student names Jessica Chen, last seen on the Serpent's Path trail yesterday evening. I pressed the talk button, already knowing this wouldn't end well. Copy that, dispatch. Any companions? Negative. Solo hiker. Her car's still at the Whispering Pines trailhead. Solo hiker. The worst kind of search and rescue operation in these parts. Whispers Creek has claimed 17 people in the past 3 years, and only 4 of them were ever found. The lucky ones were discovered within the first 24 hours, usually suffering from exposure and telling impossible stories about shadows that walked upright and yellow eyes that followed them through the trees. The unlucky ones, well, we found pieces. Never enough to determine what had happened to them. I secured my gear and headed toward Serpent's Path, the most treacherous trail in the forest. The name wasn't just poetic. The path twisted and turned like a snake's back. leading deep into the heart of the wilderness where cell towers couldn't reach and GPS signals died. The Cherokee had another name for this place, Nvhinze Senze, Sunze, which translates roughly to the place where spirits hunt. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It's an occupational hazard for forest rangers. Spend enough time alone in the woods, and you develop a sixth sense about being observed. But this felt different, heavier, heavier. Like whatever was watching had been doing so for a very long time. The first sign appeared 2 miles in, a tree broken clean in half about 12 feet up. No storm had passed through recently, and the break was too clean, too precise. The Cherokee side of my brain recognized it immediately. A territorial marker. Something big had been here, something that wanted others to know this was its domain. The second sign came at mile marker 3, tracks in the soft earth beside the creek. At first glance, they looked human, 5 toes, a heel, and arch, but they were enormous, easily 18 inches long and 6 inches wide. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds. I photographed them with my trail camera, knowing the images would join the others in a file that park management preferred to ignore. Signs 3 through 6 appeared in rapid succession as I pushed deeper into the forest. Massive stones arranged in perfect circles as if something had been conducting a ceremony. Trees with bark stripped away in precise spirals 15 feet off the ground. A deer carcass hanging from a branch, drained of blood, but showing no signs of predation. And most unsettling of all, a pile of human belongings. Hiking boots, a water bottle, a fleece jacket, arranged in a neat circle around a fire pit that hadn't been used in weeks. The seventh sign was Jessica Chen herself. I found her at mile marker 5, sitting cross-legged beneath a massive oak tree. She was alive, which should have been the best possible news. Instead, my Cherokee instincts screamed danger. Jessica sat perfectly still, her eyes wide open and completely white, as if the pupils and irises had simply vanished. She was breathing, but slowly, mechanically, like someone in the deepest stages of sleep. Jessica? I approached carefully, my hand instinctively moving to the 45 on my hip. Jessica, can you hear me? She turned her head toward me with unnatural precision, like a mechanical doll. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo that seemed to come from deep underground. He's been waiting for you, Kennedy. The tall one with no face. He remembers your bloodline. My grandmother's voice whispered in the back of my mind. When the forest speaks through human tongues, do not listen. Do not listen. Do not trust. Do not follow. Jessica, we need to get you to a hospital. You've been out here for over 18 hours. I activated my emergency beacon, praying it would reach through the canopy. Can you stand? He showed me things, she continued, her white eyes somehow focusing on me despite having no pupils. The place where the missing people go, the feeding ground, the nursery where he keeps the children. What children, Jessica? The ones who got lost playing hide and seek in 1987. The family that disappeared from their campsite in 1994. The Boy Scouts from 2001. Her voice grew softer, more distant. They're all there, Kennedy, all still alive, still waiting for someone to come find them. Find them. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the oak tree. Then another. Something massive was moving through the underbrush, circling us with deliberate slowness. I drew my weapon, though I suspected bullets would be useless against whatever was coming. He wants to trade, Jessica whispered. Inkadara, one guardian for all the lost ones, your blood for their freedom. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. In that impossible quiet, I heard something that made my Cherokee blood run cold. Children laughing and playing as if from a great distance. Where are they, Jessica? Where does he keep them? She smiled and her white eyes began to weep tears of black sap. Follow the spiral path, past the boneyard, through the shadow valley, to the place where the earth opens like a mouth. A shadow fell across us, far too large to belong to any tree. I looked up and saw nothing but canopy, yet the darkness persisted, growing deeper by the second. Jessica's skin began to take on a grayish pallor, and I realized she wasn't breathing anymore. Jessica! I knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, but her wrist was cold as stone. According to my watch, she'd been dead for at least 6 hours, yet she'd been speaking to me just moments before. Park management could explain away a lot of things, but they couldn't explain away conversations with corpses. The shadow lifted as suddenly as it had appeared, and the forest sounds returned in a rush. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the creek resumed its gentle murmur. Its gentle murmur. Jessica's eyes had returned to their normal brown color, though she remained lifeless. I called in her location and waited for the recovery team, but my mind was already working on the real problem. 17 missing people. And according to a dead woman, they were all still alive somewhere in these woods, waiting for rescue. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Kekle, the giant cannibal who stalked the Cherokee in the old days. She said our ancestors learned to track it by following the spiral of broken trees and arranged stones. She said it could speak through the dead and make bargains with the living. She also said that sometimes a guardian would have to walk into the monster's domain to bring the lost ones home. Ow! As I waited for backup, I studied my trail map. There was indeed a spiraling pattern of old-growth trees that led deeper into the wilderness, past a section locals called the Boneyard, where hunters often found unusual animal remains. Beyond that lay a valley that never appeared on any official maps, a place where shadows seemed to pool even on the brightest days. The recovery team arrived just before sunset, and we carried Jessica's body out of the forest. But I knew I'd be coming back. The Cherokee in me demanded it. 17 people were depending on someone to find them, and despite every rational instinct screaming at me to transfer to a nice, safe fire tower in Montana, I knew that someone had to be me. That night, I sat on my cabin porch and prepared for the hunt. I cleaned my grandfather's rifle, the one he'd carried in Korea, and passed down through 3 generations of Cherokee men. I packed traditional supplies alongside modern gear, cornmeal and tobacco for offerings, sage for cleansing, and a piece of black flint my grandmother had given me before she died. For when you meet the thing that shouldn't be, she'd said, Cherokee magic still works if you remember how to use it. As I packed, I tried not to think about the fact that none of the previous 17 searchers had ever returned. I tried not to think about Jessica's white eyes and her impossible conversation. I tried not to think about the children's laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. But mostly, I tried not to think about the thing my grandmother had whispered to me on her deathbed. The Kekle isn't just hunting people, Kanadi. It's collecting them, building something. And when it has enough, she died before finishing the sentence, but I'd always known how it ended. When it has enough, it won't need to hide in the forest anymore. I set out before dawn, following the spiral pattern I'd mapped the night before. The forest felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, older, more watchful, as if the trees themselves were ancient sentinels keeping track of every intruder. Stakerberfy. My flashlight beam seemed smaller than usual, swallowed by shadows that moved independently of any breeze. The first mile passed without incident, following a game trail that wound between massive pines. But as I approached the area where the spiral began in earnest, I started noticing things that hadn't been there on my previous patrols. Fresh scratches on tree bark, too high to be made by any normal animal. Patches of ground where the earth had been disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged through the undergrowth. And hanging from branches at exactly head height, small bundles of bones and feathers tied with sinew, Cherokee warning signs that someone had been marking territory. My radio had died somewhere around mile 2, which should have been impossible given its range. My GPS showed my location as a fuzzy approximation somewhere northwest of nowhere. Even my mechanical compass seemed confused, its needle spinning slowly as if it couldn't quite decide where magnetic north had gone. The boneyard announced itself long before I saw it. The smell hit me first, not the clean scent of naturally decomposed remains, but something fouler, more organic. Like a slaughterhouse that had been left to rot in the summer heat, I tied a bandana around my nose and mouth, more for psychological comfort than any real protection. The clearing opened up suddenly, a perfect circle, maybe 50 yards across. The ground was carpeted with bones, not just animal bones, but things I couldn't immediately identify. Femurs that were too long, skulls with too many teeth, rib cages that seemed designed for creatures that had never walked the earth. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches forming an almost perfect canopy overhead. That's where I found the first real evidence of human presence. Carved into the oak's bark about 7 feet up were symbols I recognized from my grandmother's teachings, Cherokee syllabary mixed with older markings, symbols that predated any written language. The carvings were fresh, the sap still bleeding from the cuts. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew the old ways. I photographed the symbols, then took out the piece of black flint my grandmother had given me. Cherokee tradition held that flint could cut through spiritual deceptions, revealing truth where lies had been planted. I scraped a small piece of bark away from beneath the symbols and was startled to see what looked like names carved underneath. Michael Torres, 2019. Sarah Kim, 2020. The Hendricks family, 2021. All missing persons from my files. Sons from my files. A branch snapped behind me and I spun around to see a figure standing at the edge of the boneyard. For a moment, my heart leaped. Another survivor, someone else who'd found their way to this place. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the figure wasn't quite right. Too tall, maybe 7.5 feet. Too thin, as if someone had stretched a normal person like taffy. And where its face should have been, there was only smooth skin, blank as a mannequin. The creature, I couldn't think of it as human anymore, tilted its head to one side with a motion that reminded me of a curious dog. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from somewhere inside my own head. The guardian arrives. Good. We have been waiting. Where are they? I kept my rifle trained on the center of its mass, though I doubted conventional weapons would have much effect. Where are the missing people? Safe, fed, cared for. They sleep now in the deep places, dreaming dreams we give them. I want to see them. The faceless thing gestured toward the far side of the clearing, where I now noticed a path leading downward between two massive boulders. The shadows between the stones seemed darker than they should have been, as if light simply couldn't penetrate whatever lay beyond. Come then, Guardian. Guardian, see what becomes of the lost. Not until you explain the deal. Jessica said you wanted to trade. Jessica speaks still. Interesting. Death sits lightly on some spirits. The creature moved closer, and I caught a scent like wet earth and copper pennies. Yes, a trade. One life freely given for 17 lives freely returned. The Guardian's blood for the freedom of the collected. Why me specifically? Why not any of the other searchers? Because you carry the old blood. Cherokee magic. The spiral path recognizes you, calls to you. Calls to you. Your ancestors knew us, hunted us, drove us into the deep places. But you came looking. I thought about my grandmother's stories about the warriors who had ventured into the creature's domain to rescue captives. Most of them never returned. The few who did were changed forever, marked by whatever they'd seen in the darkness below. Show me they're alive first, then we'll talk about trades. The creature nodded, a disturbingly human gesture from something that clearly wasn't, and began walking toward the shadowed path. I followed, keeping my rifle ready and trying to ignore the way the bones crunched under my boots. The path descended more steeply than seemed possible, as if we were walking into the earth itself rather than down a hillside. The walls on either side were smooth stone, too smooth to be natural, carved with more of the symbols I'd seen on the oak tree. Emergency LED lights would have been useless here. The darkness seemed to absorb illumination, making my flashlight beam barely visible beyond a few feet. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the path opened into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling disappeared into blackness overhead, and the space was filled with what looked like enormous spider webs, except the strands were too thick, too organic. Caught in the web, suspended 10 or 15 feet off the ground were cocoons, human-shaped cocoons. Jesus Christ, I whispered. He hears little in these depths, the creature replied, but they dream beautiful dreams. Watch, one of the cocoons nearest to us began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. Through the translucent membrane, I could see a human form, a young man, maybe early 20s. His eyes were closed, but his lips were moving as if he were having a conversation with someone. As I watched, he smiled and laughed silently. Michael Torres, I said, recognizing him from a missing person photo. He dreams he is home with his family, celebrating his birthday. They have made him a cake, sung him songs. He is happy, while you slowly digest him, while we keep him safe, fed. Preserved. There are worse fates than comfortable dreams. I counted the cocoons, 17 just as Jessica had said. Men, women, children, all suspended in that terrible web, all lost in whatever artificial paradise the creature had created for them. The trade, I said, explain it. You take their place. Your dreams will be different, darker, but they will be returned to the surface unharmed, believing they were lost for only a day or two. Your sacrifice saves them. And if I refuse, they remain. Eventually, they will become like us, guardians of the deep places, collectors of the lost. It is not so terrible a fate. I thought about the families waiting for these people to come home, parents who hadn't slept in years, wondering what had happened to their children, spouses checking their phones every few minutes hoping for word, children asking when daddy was coming back. Then I thought about my grandmother's final words, about the creature building something, collecting people for some larger purpose. What are you really doing here? What's the end game? The faceless creature was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its mental voice carried what might have been sadness. We are the last, the final remnants of something your people helped to destroy. We do not reproduce as you do. We do not age as you do. We simply persist. But persistence requires sustenance, and sustenance requires dreams. You're feeding off their minds. We are preserving them. When the surface world destroys itself, as all worlds eventually do, these dreams will remain. Perfect moments trapped forever in amber. They will be all that survives of your species. I raised my rifle. Let them go. You would doom them to return to your world of violence and cruelty and eventual death? This is mercy, Guardian, their choice to make, not yours. The creature moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was directly in front of me, its smooth face inches from mine. I felt something probing at the edges of my consciousness, trying to slip inside my thoughts. Sleep, Guardian, dream of better things. But Cherokee magic runs deeper than most people realize, and my grandmother had taught me more than just stories. I pressed the piece of black flint against the creature's chest and spoke the words she'd made me memorize. Use the NVHI, GVALIL Tsunsdi, NVHIL Diactivi. Little spirit, I command you to leave. Spirit and human are separate. The creature recoiled as if I'd hit it with live electricity. The mental pressure disappeared, and for a moment its smooth face rippled like water, revealing something underneath that I really didn't want to see clearly. Old magic, it hissed. Older than we expected. Let them go or I'll use more than words. But the creature was already backing away, melting into the shadows between the web strands. Its voice echoed from all around the chamber now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The trade remains open, Guardian. Return when you understand that mercy sometimes wears the face of imprisonment. The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones falling from the invisible ceiling. The webs holding the cocoons started to sway alarmingly, and I realized the creature was bringing the whole place down around us. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice. Run for the surface and leave 17 people to their eternal dreams, or try to cut them down and carry them out before the chamber collapsed. My grandmother always said that being Cherokee meant making the hard choices, even when they were impossible. I started climbing toward the nearest cocoon, my knife in one hand and my emergency rope in the other. The creature's laughter followed me up into the web, cold and ancient and completely without humor. 17 lives, Guardian. Can you save them all before the mountain falls? I reached Michael Torres first and started cutting through the membrane of his cocoon. The material was tougher than it looked, more like cartilage than spider silk. As my knife finally penetrated, viscous fluid began pouring out, and Michael's eyes snapped open. He looked directly at me and said, "Tell my mom the birthday cake was perfect." Then he started screaming. Michael Torres screamed for exactly 17 seconds before falling unconscious. I managed to lower him to the chamber floor using my emergency rope, but the delay cost me precious time. The ceiling continued to rain debris, and larger chunks of stone were beginning to fall. I had 16 more people to save, and maybe 10 minutes before the whole place caved in. The Cherokee in me said to cut my losses, grab Michael, and run for the surface. The Ranger in me said 17 people had families who deserved to have them home. and the part of me that remembered my grandmother's stories said that sometimes the only way to win against a Kekle Kudle was to do something so crazy it didn't expect it. I started cutting down cocoons as fast as I could, letting them fall to the chamber floor with wet, sickening thuds. Some of the people inside were still dreaming. I could see their eyes moving beneath closed lids, their faces peaceful and content. Others, like Michael, snapped awake the moment their cocoons ruptured, their expressions shifting from bliss to absolute terror in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah Kim, the graduate student who disappeared while researching local folklore. She woke up swinging, trying to fight off invisible attackers until I managed to calm her down enough to explain where we were. The Hendricks family, mother, father, 2 children aged 8 and 12. They woke up together, holding hands even as their dream fluid drained away, and I realized the creature had been letting them share their dreams. For 3 years, they'd been living in a fantasy version of their interrupted camping trip, where nothing bad ever happened and they could stay together forever. By the time I'd cut down 12 of the 17, my arms felt like lead and the chamber was shaking so violently I could barely stand. The faceless creature's voice echoed from the darkness above, no longer angry but almost sad. You saved them to return to what? Divorce papers? Cancer diagnoses? Car accidents? Economic collapse? The dreams we gave them were better than anything your world offers. That's not your choice to make, I shouted back, sawing through another cocoon membrane. This one contained a Boy Scout from the 2001 disappearance, now a man in his 30s, but preserved exactly as he'd been at age 12. Look at them, Guardian. Look at what you are dragging them back to. I looked. Some of the rescued people were catatonic, staring at nothing with expressions of devastating loss. Others were sobbing uncontrollably, as if they'd just learned of the death of everyone they'd ever loved. Michael Torres was curled in a fetal position, whispering, "It's not real, it's not real, it's not real," over and over again. "They'll heal," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Will they? Or will they spend the rest of their lives trying to return to the dreams you stole from them? That's so. I cut down the 15th person, a middle-aged hiker who'd disappeared 6 months ago. She woke up screaming my name, which was impossible since we'd never met. But then she grabbed my arm with desperate strength. "You have to stop cutting them down," she gasped. "It's not what you think. We're not prisoners, we're guards. We're keeping something else locked up." What? But the chamber chose that moment to really start collapsing. A chunk of ceiling the size of a pickup truck crashed down, missing me by inches. The woman was crushed instantly, her final words lost in the roar of falling stone. 2 more cocoons. I could see them hanging just out of reach, swaying in the chaos. The smart thing would have been to gather up the 15 survivors and get them to safety. But I'd come this far, and Cherokee's stubbornness runs deep. I started climbing again, using the web strands like rope, trying to reach the last 2 people before everything came down. As I climbed, I realized the woman had been right about one thing. The chamber wasn't just collapsing, it was opening. The falling debris was revealing other passages, other chambers, all of them filled with a blue-white light that hurt to look at directly. And from those passages came sounds, not the creature's voice, but something else, something that had been locked away for a very long time and was now stirring. I reached the 16th cocoon and started cutting, but my knife was getting dull and the membrane was thicker here, older. Through the translucent wall, I could see an elderly man, maybe 70 years old. But according to my files, he disappeared as a 25-year-old hiker in 1995. The creature had been keeping him in dreams for nearly 30 years. As his cocoon ruptured, he opened eyes that held 3 decades of accumulated wisdom and terror. "Boy," he whispered, his voice like autumn leaves, "you've doomed us all." The blue light from the other chambers was getting brighter, and the sounds were getting louder. Not quite human, not quite animal, but definitely alive and definitely angry about being awakened. What is it? I shouted over the noise of the collapse. "The reason the Kekle Kudle exists," he said. "The reason it collects dreams, it's not feeding on us. It's using our dreams to keep the barrier strong, to keep the NVHI diactivi sleeping. NVHI activi, spirit demons from the deepest Cherokee legends. The things that existed before the world was made, trapped beneath the earth by the first medicine men and women. My grandmother had told me stories, but I'd always thought they were metaphors. The 17th cocoon was just above me, but it was different from the others. Larger, older, and pulsing with its own internal light. As I reached for it, the elderly man grabbed my ankle. Don't! That one's not human anymore. That one's become something else. But it was too late. My knife had already pierced the membrane, and what poured out wasn't fluid but pure light, blinding, searing, impossible light that burned away shadows and revealed things that should have stayed hidden. The thing that had been in the 17th cocoon unfurled like a flower made of starfire and screaming wind. It had been human once. I could see the remnants of a human form at its core, but decades of dreams and spirit energy had transformed it into something between guardian and God. Finally, it said, and its voice was the sound of mountains being born. Finally, the seals are broken. The blue light from the other chambers erupted outward, and I saw what we'd really accomplished. The Kikle Kudle hadn't been torturing people. It had been using their dreams as fuel to maintain a prison, and I'd just set all the prisoners free. The faceless creature materialized beside me, no longer threatening but almost pleading. Do you understand now, Guardian? Do you see why we needed them? Around us, the mountain was splitting open like an overripe fruit. Things that had been locked away since the Cherokee first learned to speak were clawing their way to the surface, eager to reclaim a world they'd been banished from eons ago. How do we fix this? I asked. We cannot. But you can contain them for a while, your blood freely given, your dreams willingly shared. Become what they were, and perhaps the barriers can be rebuilt. I looked down at the 15 people I'd rescued. They were huddled together, staring up at the chaos above them with expressions of dawning horror. They understood now what they'd lost, what they'd been protecting the world from simply by sleeping. The transformed human thing drifted closer, its voice like singing crystal. Join us, Cherokee Guardian. Join us in the deep places and help us hold back the dark. I thought about my grandmother's stories about the warriors who went into the monster's cave and never came back. I'd always wondered if they'd died or just found something more important than coming home. Now I knew. Get them out, I told the Kikle Kudle. All 15. Get them to the surface, make them forget the worst of this. Let them think they were just lost in the woods for a few days. And you? I pulled out my knife and drew it across my palm, letting Cherokee blood drip onto the chamber floor. The stone hissed where it landed, and the cracks spreading through the ceiling began to slow. And I stay. Someone has to guard the guards. The faceless creature nodded, something like respect in its posture. It will not be pleasant dreams, Guardian. Cherokee warriors don't dream of pleasant things. As the creature began herding the survivors toward the surface, I felt the change beginning. My blood was soaking into the stone, and the stone was soaking into me. I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching the prison walls that held back things older than civilization. The last thing I saw before the transformation completed was Michael Torres looking back at me from the tunnel entrance. He raised his hand in a small salute, and I realized he understood. They all understood now. They'd carry the memory of what they'd lost, but they'd also carry the knowledge of why it had been necessary. The mountain sealed itself around me, and I felt my human thoughts beginning to scatter like leaves in an autumn wind. But at the core of my being, the part that would persist through eternity, I held on to one simple truth. Sometimes being a guardian means becoming the thing you're guarding against. Sometimes the monster is the hero of the story. And sometimes the only way to save the world is to disappear into the darkness and make sure the really dangerous things stay asleep. In the depths beneath Whispers Creek National Forest, I join my voice to the ancient song that keeps the NVHI Dayak TV dreaming. Every day, new hikers disappear into these woods. Every day, new dreamers are needed to maintain the barriers. And every day, I remember my grandmother's final words, when it has enough, it won't need to hide in the forest anymore. We never have enough. We never will. But we keep trying. Because that's what guardians do.